The idea of an inquisition grew out of many discussions with parties on both sides of the ESG fence. In fact, on both extremes of the ESG fence. What became very clear early on was that there was much confusion regarding different kinds of ESG reporting, what each one entailed, and especially why ESG is important in public reporting practices. So the Inquisition was then born. The objectives of this event are to highlight the significance of ESG, both in the international minerals community as well as in the South African context. We know the SAMES guidelines are being redrafted, and so what we want to do is to solicit comments from industry on potential improvements. So it doubles as an industry consultation on the update of the SAMES guidelines, which in turn are going to feed into the next update of SAMREC. We're going to be asking questions such as the difference between sustainability reports, annual reports, competent persons reports. What is industry view regarding what needs to go in, what shouldn't be going in? We're going to be asking questions and soliciting opinions. We are not going to draw any conclusions today. We're not going to give clarity. We're also not going to make any decisions as to what should be in mineral resource reports or annual reports. All the information that we're taking today, the questions that we're asking, the opinions that we're soliciting, these will all be used to inform the updates to the codes. So that information will go along to the different code committees, guideline committees, and at a later stage, a draft will be sent out to industry for comments, no doubt, and hopefully that might even lead to a second inquisition.
Sorry, Tanya, your screen on both sides is cut off.
So if we look at the program for the next couple of days, day one, we start off with looking at the international experience in ESG. Then we come down to the local scale to see what our regulatory bodies are thinking, and also commentary from investors, accountants, as well as other stakeholders. We've got a bunch of short presentations. We're looking at 15 minutes, including question time, and we need to strictly adhere to the timing, folks. If we don't get through all the questions in each presentation, please just pop your questions in the chat. The presenters will be able to answer from there. We've got a couple of recorded presentations. Just put your questions in the chat, label it whether it's for Jeff or for Lee, and then we'll send questions to them and get the answers back. We'll also have a longer Q&A session at the end of today's session, and many of the presenters will still be around to answer questions. Just a reminder that the program and the biographies of our speakers are all in the virtual bag, which you have been sent. Lally has also posted it on the chat. So we will not be doing a detailed presentation of each speaker as they come in. They will just start, speak, and you can check out their bios in the bag. Day two starts off with a keynote address and then moves on into the panel discussions. We've got 3 panel discussions: how companies deal with sustainability reports, the annual reports, and also competent persons reports. along with short presentations. This is where there is plenty of time for you to ask questions, give your comments, give your opinions. And it's all of this information that we need in order to take it back to the various code committees for them to be able to draw up a code, draw up a guideline that is going to be of use to you. But very briefly, a reminder of our housekeeping rules. Please keep your video and your microphone off if you're not presenting, and don't fiddle with the presentation tools. And finally, thanks to our annual sponsors. And at this stage, I'll hand you back to the chair. Sarah, it is all yours.
Brilliant. So thank you very much, everybody, for having me here today. It's a great honour to be speaking with all of you as well, especially with regards to everybody who's been involved in the development of SAMESC, which from a geological perspective and the mineral resources and reserves perspective has really led the way in terms of what is required, or the beginnings perhaps of what is required in all of those international reporting codes with regards to mineralogical resources and reserves. So thank you very much, Sarah and Tanya and the rest of the group for inviting me here to speak. Now, I'm going to start really, really broad, because I'm acutely aware that there's a huge amount of detail that's going to be shared with everybody over the next couple of days. And I'm not even going to begin to try and preempt some of that. And instead, I'm going to start by giving that basic background to what is changing with regards to sustainability, and also the expectations of what is required with regards to sustainability, also, of course, sometimes known as ESG, of the extractive sector by a number of different stakeholders. And why is this important? Well, it's important because actually many of the different requirements that are being placed on us are, of course, being driven by stakeholders who come from outside of the mining sector. So just by way of background, so I'm originally a geologist, and so I started out as an exploration geologist. I then worked on site, and now I not only am a co-founder of Responsible Raw Materials, which is a not-for-profit that was founded back in 2020, because of course over the last couple of years we've had nothing else to do with our lives. But my normal day job is I run a risk management consultancy called Satala. And so many of the examples that you'll see here today have been drawn whilst working with phenomenal experts around the world, all of whom are focused on making sustainability a reality rather than just greenwashing or a tick box. So just to get cracking with this, and don't worry, Tanya, I've got many slides here, all of which I will make sure we post on our website, because there's quite a lot of detail and links to different videos. If people want to use it as a bit of a reference document, we'll make sure that they are all available for you. So let's start at the beginning, or let's take a big step back. Well, of course, within the world of the extractive sector, we've always thought about sustainability. Most of us are really good at working out there with nature, etc. So it is nothing new to us. But from a more formalized perspective, of course, if we go back to 1987, and we've got the Brundtland Commission, or of course that report, Our Common Future, where they actually defined what was perhaps meant by sustainable development as being development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the needs of the future. Interestingly, this has, of course, developed or evolved since then, so that we're not only protecting our world or our environment for the future, we're also embracing opportunities where we can perhaps enhance the world in which we live in for the future. And this is perhaps very much at the core of some of the extractives companies' change in perhaps their values and their direction that we've seen over the last 10 years, where some organizations see themselves as more development companies rather than, say, mining companies. And that's really exciting, because actually what it means is that those organizations are recognizing the fact that when they're extracting something from the ground, they are very much temporary land stewards. And so therefore they really need to be planning and working towards what does the future look like after we've extracted that material from the ground, that of course we need to really very much power the world economy and everything that goes on within it. So back in 1987, this is perhaps what the world thought of when we were thinking about sustainability. We had various Venn diagrams that looked at social, environment, economics, etc. Since then, of course, we've had many different standards. For example, we had the Millennium Goals, etc., that then, of course, were updated back in 2015 to form the Sustainable Development Goals, which provides that framework that, of course, many different organizations, be they public or be they private, latch onto in terms of saying, okay, how are we going to make sustainability a reality? Now, the problem with regards to these Sustainable Development Goals is, of course, they are all fabulous, but they do actually conflict with one another. So, for example, if all we cared about was carbon, which is, of course, part of number 13, so climate action, if that's all we cared about, that would be lovely, but we would probably focus on it so much to the detriment of some of those other sustainable development goals. So the key with regards to sustainability is to look at the interaction between all the different component parts and be able to make that very grown-up, balanced decision where we say, okay, what are the potential opportunities and threats that sit on the table with regards to all of these different goals? So we've got things like 1987 Brundtland Commission, we've got things like the 2015 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, the latest iteration of all of this is this concept or this thing that we call ESG, okay, which also stands for environment, social and governance. Now, of course, I'm sure that many individuals will be diving into detail as to what this really means for us within the extractive sector, but just to highlight some of this with regards to these different areas. Of course, on the environmental side, we're talking about everything from the management of our waste. We're talking about rehabilitation. We're talking about noise and vibration. We're talking about water. We're talking about biodiversity, permits, and of course, climate change. On the social side, we're talking about what is our relationship like with local communities and beyond? What about those expectations for shared value, local procurement, site access, stakeholder engagement, and of course, health and safety as well? And then what about governance? What does governance actually mean? And in certain parts of the world, it's the G, it's the governance that forms massive problems because people don't necessarily, they find it really difficult to say, well, what does that mean for us? And so, for example, when we start taking a look at 43101, so that reporting code in Canada, this has been the sticking point with regards to that moving forwards of incorporating ESG within that particular code. And that's because the interpretation of what governance actually means within that jurisdiction can be very difficult. But the broadest definition, as we can see here, is that we're talking about both corporate governance, so how do we actually run our businesses, as well as what's coming in from the government and the regulatory bodies and all of that coming together. So we're talking tax transparency, we're talking business ethics, and we're also holding ourselves to account. So that very much comes into being with regards to all of this. Now, if you want to see some additional videos with regards to what is perhaps meant by the E, the S and the G, back in May, we ran a free conference. So it was a whole week long, full of 10-minute talks. So these are nice and short. But if you want to go and check these out, again, as I mentioned, we'll make sure that all of this presentation is available on our website at Responsible Raw Materials. And so you can follow the links and directly go to these talks to find out more detail with regards to all of them. Now, to support all of this, as I mentioned, of course, we've seen that evolution since the 1980s, and we continue to see this evolution even now. So, for example, we're seeing things like, and this only goes up to, well, prior to 2020, really, all of these different guidelines, practices, standard codes, etc. And every single one that you can see on this chart here could be relevant to mining, okay? So this is something here where we're seeing massive growth and evolution with regards to the presentations, with regards to all of those different guidelines and standards that we're perhaps expected to deal with from a mining sector perspective. But it's not just these, it's also we can then go beyond this. And we're talking about industry expectations, so things from, say, for example, the International Council for Mining and Metals, or specific commodities to the World Gold Council. But then we can go into the world of finance and things like carbon disclosure. So TCFD, this is something that I'm sure you're all aware of, that is making big waves within Europe at the moment, where financial organizations have to begin to disclose on what their carbon footprint could be within their organizations, which is fascinating, because that then means that these organizations, these financial institutes, have to then go deeper into their portfolios and understand what those portfolios actually mean. It also means that we need to start thinking outside of our usual boundaries. And so if we come back into the extractive sector again and say, well, what do we actually include within this? If you ask somebody about mining, invariably, the average person on the street will tell you about a big hole in the ground, perhaps with lots of dirt and people wearing hard hats and high-vis jackets. But of course, we all know that it's much broader than that. And actually, the extractives industry is something that's absolutely integral with the circular economy, because of course, without mining, etc., without extracting all of those raw products, we can't actually feed the circular economy. And so what we're seeing here is this merging, as it were, of two different worlds that until earlier on this year really didn't like to speak to one another very much. So you had the circular economy and then you had mining, but actually people have very much woken up and realized, hang on a second, the world's population is growing, our technology is changing, we therefore need more and a wider mix of different commodities to be able to pull in to this cycle. Within the cycle itself, of course, we need to get better at designing things like those washing machines or those mobile phones so that the component parts can either be repurposed or recycled, because of course, at the moment, we are absolutely terrible at doing that. And so therefore, we generally throw all of that material away or we give it to another country. And so this is something here where we're seeing massive research going into this, especially in countries like the United Kingdom, where until 18 months ago or so prior to 18 months ago, we were part of this thing called Europe. Unfortunately, the country voted for this thing called Brexit. And what that's now meant is in the UK, we now don't actually have a mineral strategy, because prior to Brexit, we were very much part of Europe. Whereas now within the United Kingdom, you're seeing this massive change in terms of, okay, what can we actually do with all of this? How do we make sure we have all those raw materials that we actually need? Without being too rude about it, I think we are gently getting there with some of our senior decision makers who until recently thought we could just dig everything out of the ground within the United Kingdom. And as a geologist, of course, that would be truly delightful, but we know that the rocks just aren't there. So what does this mean? This means that we need to be thinking about the extractive sector in a slightly different way. It's not just the physical mining and processing, it is also that full value chain. And what does that mean? Which of course, therefore drives the demand for all the materials, etc., that we produce from the primary resources end of things. Now, in terms of ensuring that all of this is as responsible as possible, of course, there are many, many different tools and techniques that we can look at. And this little infographic that we have here, this just tries to portray some of the stakeholders, okay, and also some of the different tools and techniques that you might find. So the stakeholders are in the dark speech bubbles, and the different tools and techniques that people may be utilizing to make sure that sustainability or ESG can be a reality are in the white speech bubbles that we have here. And this is important. Why? Well, it's important because if we just said that the mining sector or the extractive sector are the only ones who actually have to make sustainability a reality, we're going to have a very tough time of it. Instead, it is a case where all of the different stakeholders have to come together and we all need to be pushing in the same direction. And this was something here where we ran a conference back in 2019 with the Geological Society here in the UK. And this was a case where we said, right, well, let's just take the concept of responsible investment. What does it mean to different stakeholders? What does that actually mean to investors, to NGOs, communities, the extractives companies themselves. And of course, responsible investing means something slightly different to all of those different communities. And that's a case where we need to be able to get underneath the skin of what is required by these different organizations, because by understanding those perspectives, we can then say, okay, so what sort of information do you actually need from me in order for me to prove that I am doing this in the most responsible way possible? Now, don't worry, Sarah, I'm not going to go through all of these slides now, but just to show you what will be available online in the next couple of hours, is there's a series of appendix slides that follow this presentation that look at what are some of the specific perspectives and requirements from the viewpoint of mining companies, stewardship and procurement, the circular economy, so everything that's going on in that world, finance, and that includes both investors and insurers. So of course, insurers are very important with regards to this particular party, governments and regulators, NGOs and activists, and then of course, society as a whole. And by society, what I'm meaning here is society on a global scale, because of course, different nations, different cultures have their own perspectives with regards to this as well. And so what you will find in the slide deck are some background information with regards to all of these, together with links to nice little 10-minute videos that will supplement your learning. Now, one thing I would just mention, Sarah, before I hit my final slide, is just with regards to the first one. And of course, being a geologist, I'm going to talk about the rocks. I'm going to leave all of this to the experts that you guys have managed to pull together for this fabulous 2 days of discussion and insight. But what I would say is, from a global perspective, thank you so much to SAMESC and everybody in South Africa, because when it comes to mineral reporting, South Africa has really led the way in saying, look, this is possible, this is what we need to be doing. And if you haven't already seen it, back in January of this year, we held some roundtables where we invited the likes of Tanya and Teresa, who I know are on this call right now. So they represented South Africa, but we also heard from the Europeans, the Australians, the Americans, the Canadians, Mongolia, Indonesia, China, and I've probably forgotten at least one. But what we did there was we got insight as to what is everybody doing with regards to their own codes and standards from their part of the world. What I would encourage you to do in a little coffee break, or perhaps later on this afternoon, is to go to just the 5-minute teaser trailer, because that will give you an overview as to what everybody was saying back in January with regards to the updating of these codes. Supplementing all of that, of course, are some background abstracts, etc. So there's some more information on the website there for you as well. So just in closing, with regards to all of this, what does this actually mean? Well, it means that actually the world, thank goodness, is beginning to wake up to the fact that actually, if we are going to be able to achieve things like energy transition, our green industrial revolution, whatever we want to call it, we actually need extraction, which is brilliant. So the world is beginning to come to the table on that, rather than just saying, no, we need to stop extracting hydrocarbons, etc. The world actually now is beginning to realize, hang on a second, we do need this stuff. The circular economy, of course, can help, but people are now realizing it certainly can't do it all. We've currently got way too many standards. There's a forest of standards, and so many people are spending a huge amount of time wading through all of it. And the problem with a lot of it is that there's a lot of tick boxing rather than real action and impact. And the investors and owners and everybody else are beginning to very much wake up and see, okay, so how do we make this transition from ticking a box into real impact and action? Let's stop asking the tick boxing questions, and instead let's look at the action and impact. With regards to that as well, there's a massive focus on, rather than just looking for compliance, actually looking for opportunity and upside with regards to all of this. So we want to look for the opportunities with regards to ESG. This isn't a bad thing that needs to be protected. This is a good opportunity that we need to be driving through everything that we're doing. And finally, with regards to this, there's a requirement for every single one of us to step up every stakeholder, be us an investor, a procurer, a government official, or a mining company or society, actually understanding if we need that sustainable future, we all need to be working together and pushing in the same direction. So with that, I'll hand back to Sarah. And if there's any time for questions, I'd welcome them. If not, please do feel free just to get in contact with us via the email address you see on the screen.
Hi, I'm Lee White. I have the privilege of being the Executive Director at the IFRS Foundation. Firstly, thank you to the Geological Society of South Africa for your kind invitation to allow me to participate in your conference. Now, I would have preferred to have done this in a more dynamic virtual way, but unfortunately with commitments, I've had to do this recording. I hope you find it valuable. And at the end of this presentation, there'll be further contact information for those that wish to gather more detail than I'm able to share during the course of this presentation. Now, for many of you, you may ask the question, who is the IFRS Foundation? We're an international organisation. We're primarily based in London in the United Kingdom. We're a not-for-profit organisation, and over the last 20 years, the work has been predominantly around the creation through the ISB, financial reporting standards. So today I'm going to share a little bit about the current initiative by the trustees, that's the oversight group over the IFRS Foundation, the trustees' initiatives on sustainability related reporting. Now, my colleague Claire will be helping me with the slides. Claire, if we could go to the next one, please. Thank you. So during the back end of calendar year 2020, the trustees were very much becoming aware of a number of factors that was leading to their attention being drawn on to this level of sustainability related reporting. They could see there was a growing and urgent demand, particularly from the investor community, but more broadly as well, including public authorities. There was clearly a need for a consistency at a global level in reporting and comparable information. And as well, and we'll talk about this in some further detail, there was a supply side in transition, meaning there are a number of organisations all doing very good work, but somewhat with more of a narrow, specific stakeholder group in mind. And therefore, that led to some level of confusion and complexity, given the level of guidance that was available. Thank you, Claire. So, Q4 2020, the trustees undertook a consultation, which was really at a strategic level, wanting to know first and foremost, was there a demand for global sustainability related disclosure standards? And if so, what role should the IFRS Foundation play, if at all? Now, in that paper, the trustees did suggest as an option the creation of a new board, one that would sit within the governance of the foundation and in effect visually sit next to the current ISB. Thank you. In the paper, and this is a very important aspect, the trustees had highlighted a number of key requirements for success, i.e. if the trustees were to go forward with the creation of this board, what really needed to be in place for it to be successful. And as you can see on this slide, no great surprises, but for an international board, we needed the global support. We need to know how to work with regional initiatives, ensure that the governance structures are appropriate, have the right level of technical expertise, seed capital and separate funding, how the synergies work with financial reporting, and importantly, that the current mission of the foundation dealing with, as I mentioned earlier, financial reporting standards are not compromised. Now, in the early months of 2021, I and my colleagues went through all of the responses that we received to that consultation paper. And these next couple of slides just give you a sense around who was responding to the paper. We got nearly 600 responses, but importantly, and perhaps more importantly than the number of responses, was the breadth of who we received those responses from, starting with the United Nations, the Financial Stability Board, and a range of other public authorities, but also key institutions in that broader sustainability area as well. So from that level of responses, the trustees could see that there was really a very growing and urgent demand for standards, and that to deliver that level of consistency and comparability on a global level. And what might be described as broad support for the foundation to play a role. That broad support was conditional, and very much the conditionality of that support was relating to those key requirements for success that I spoke about earlier. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time here. So during that first quarter of 2021, the trustees were moving at pace with the foundation staff to consider the fullness and the depth of the responses they'd received, but also to give a sense of strategic direction based on that feedback they'd received. Now, firstly, the proposed board would have an investor focus and an investor focus on enterprise value. And that was felt to fit quite well into the DNA of the foundation, given the work that the ISB has currently been undertaking as well. In terms of the scope of work, and I want to be really clear here, the trustees said they wanted to prioritise climate, but not to only do climate, and that they would consider other aspects of the broader ESG where they believed it was important for investor needs, and that there would be a global level of support. That ties neatly then into our third area of the global baseline. And this is around the approach by the proposed board to produce standards that jurisdictions can use as their baseline, but build upon for their own specific needs where they believe those needs add to their public policy initiatives or other reasons that they wish to gather greater information. And importantly, through the feedback, really the message came back, IFRS Foundation, if you're going to go ahead and create this new board, please don't start from a blank piece of paper. Please look at the excellent work that's already been developed by a number of existing organisations and their frameworks and build upon that work. Thank you, Claire. So just to give you a sense around our current working groups and committees, the trustees, there's 22 trustees in total in number. We have a smaller group of that who are really doing a lot of the heavy lifting on behalf of the trustees. All key decision making still sits with the trustees, but to help the foundation staff, there is a steering committee which provides that level of direction and oversight to the work being undertaken by the foundation staff. We have an eminent persons group, which is chaired by Jean-Claude Trichet. That group is there really to provide independent strategic advice and counsel to the trustees. We have a technical readiness working group, and that really fits in nicely to that earlier reference I made about building upon the work of existing organisations. And so as you can see here on this slide, there's reference to, and my apologies for all the acronyms, the TCFD, CDSB, the Value Reporting Foundation, previously the SASB and IIRC, and so forth. But as well, we're very fortunate to have IOSCO and the International Public Sector Accounting Standards Board observing those activities as well. And finally, we have a multilateral working group, which is just starting in its thinking and its activities, chaired by Suresh Khanna. And this will really provide an important interface between the work that the ISSB will do on its global baseline, and particularly with that investor focus on enterprise value, and some of the other international and jurisdictional initiatives with a much bigger and broader target audience. Now, I'm making this recording in the last week of July, and I want you to be aware that based on that first consultation paper on our website, and I will show you how to contact us, there is very much around the summary of feedback that I've just touched on at a high level available there for those that wish to see it. And right at this week, we've been going through a process for the last few months around proposed changes to our constitution. And in effect, depending on the feedback we get with those proposed changes, will allow the trustees then to create the proposed board within the governance of the foundation and to make the consequential amendments that they think are appropriate. Now, when I did my introductions, I mentioned about the IFRS Foundation. So the trustees are there, and I quite like this visual. I'm right in that centre line at the moment to provide governance, strategic direction, and oversight of the work currently at the moment of the International Accounting Standards Board. They're the group producing the financial reporting accounting standards. And here you could see the other red box is this proposed board that I've been making reference to as well. Now, many may not be aware, oversighting the trustees is the IFRS Foundation Monitoring Board. And that's a board that brings together the public authorities in order to deliver that level of public accountability. It's chaired by IOSCO. It involves memberships from the European Commission, the US SEC, the Japanese FSA, the Chinese Ministry of Finance, and quite a number of other organisations as well. So that just gives a sense around our governance. In the Constitution proposals, we're looking at this new board in somewhat similar to the current ISB with 14 board members, the majority full-time, and really drawn from a range of diverse skills and qualifications to make sure we can enrich the thinking, the engagement, and the development of high quality standards by this proposed new board. This slide, and I won't dwell on it too long, just gives a capture over the last few months of some of the public statements providing a level of support to the work of the IFRS Foundation. If I was to update one further here, which was approximately 2 weeks or so ago, was the work of and the public communique from the G20 finance ministers, where they had a recent meeting in Venice, and again, very similar alignment of support to the G7. So let me just give you a snapshot of where we've come from, where we are right at this moment, and looking ahead. And as you can see in this timeline, I'd covered that engagement we'd had through Q4 of 2020 on the consultation paper. I'd taken you through the first quarter of 2021 and some of the strategic direction and activities the trustees had initiated. In April, we had issued these proposed changes to the Constitution. They are or have been closed on the 29th of July. We will now spend the next couple of months dealing with the feedback from that consultation, and as well complete a range of other activities through our working groups, all to lead ideally to a final determination by the trustees by time to make announcements at COP26 in early November. Now, I said to you at the commencement of this presentation that I would give you further information on how those listening today may wish to gather greater information from the Foundation. Please come to our website, ifrs.org. You can see on there a lot of activities that I've already covered. All of the types of responses to the 2020 consultation paper are there and much more. Please sign in and register. After doing that, you can set your follows on which activities you really wish to see. You slide or set the slider to green for sustainability, and therefore you'll be kept straight up to date with all of what you wish to be kept up to date on. So let me conclude by saying thank you very much for, again, the invitation to make this relatively brief engagement with you. I wish you the very best for the rest of your conference and would look forward to further levels of engagement with you. Stay well and goodbye.
Well, thank you, Tanya and Sarah, for inviting me to speak regarding SEC considerations in the important topic of sustainable reporting. Just as a bit of background, in addition to my day job as a lawyer advising companies on disclosure and corporate governance, I also sit on the UNECE Expert Group for Resource Management, where sustainable development of resources is at the heart of our endeavors. It's at the heart of what we think about and at the heart of what we hope to achieve. Next slide, please. It's fair to say we are at a critical point in the US for sustainability disclosure. After many years of debate, regulators and investors in the US have become more focused on ESG-related disclosure requirements, particularly on climate change, but also on board diversity and workforce diversity. Shareholder activism has been successful in the last few years in focusing attention on the need for more disclosure, and not just compelling more disclosure, but also, as seen at Exxon, achieving changes on the board with the aim of directing company strategy to better address climate change through investing in more in renewables. We are certainly at a crossroads in terms of what approach the SEC as the regulator of public company disclosure in the US will take to sustainability reporting under the new administration and the new chair of the SEC, Gary Gensler. Following a request for detailed public input this spring, the SEC is now considering rules that would require companies to disclose new information about climate risks, as well as information on their workforce and boards. On climate change, the SEC chair recently announced that the SEC will propose by year-end new rules that would require companies to disclose quantitative and qualitative data on risks relating to climate change. This would be a significant change from existing rules, which take a principles-based approach to disclosure. And I'll go into a bit more on that in just a moment. On diversity, last year, the SEC revised rules on disclosure relating to what it calls human capital management, but with little specificity as to what information companies were expected to provide. So the SEC is again considering whether to require more disclosure of company board and workforce demographics, including diversity, as well as health and safety metrics. In a very recent development, last week, the SEC also approved new rules by NASDAQ, one of the two main listing authorities in the US, requiring companies to disclose information on their board diversity, but also, and this is highly controversial, to have a certain number of diverse directors on their boards, or to explain why they do not. Next slide, please. So to put this in context, the new proposed climate change disclosure would, in fact, be a notable change from the current disclosure guidance in the US, which dates back to 2010, and which was confirmed by the SEC in the last administration. Since 2010, the SEC's approach to climate change disclosure has been a principles-based approach, which effectively means it gives companies discretion to determine what is, in their view, material for investors within the context of other disclosure requirements, such as the requirement to disclose major litigation, regulation, or risk factors. With respect to the extractive industry, specific disclosures currently do not require additional environmentally focused disclosures. Oil and gas companies' reserve reporting rules do not specifically require reserve engineers to take into account environmental and social impacts in estimating reserve quantities. And the mining company rules, which were updated just in 2018, again, the SEC chose not to include specific environmental and social impacts in these new disclosure requirements. This, however, over the dissent of 2 of the SEC commissioners. Next slide, please. So why is the SEC looking now to require more sustainability-related disclosure? According to the SEC chair, this is investor-driven, as indicated by the success of shareholder activists and as conveyed to them in the public comment period just finished. Investors, they have determined, are insisting on more consistent, comparable, and decision-useful disclosures so they can put their money in companies that fit their needs. Particularly as the risks of climate change become more apparent, investors want better insight into the risks facing companies in which they invest. The SEC chair believes that investors would therefore benefit from clear rules of the road rather than the existing principles-based approach. And now it appears that the SEC has decided it should develop a mandatory disclosure rule to bring greater clarity to climate risk disclosures and for consistency and comparability. The new rules, as outlined by the chair of the SEC, would require both quantitative and qualitative disclosures. Quantitative, such as metrics relating to greenhouse gas emissions, so scope 1, 2, and possibly 3. Financial impacts of climate change, and progress toward climate-related goals, such as the Paris goals. Qualitative disclosures might be in terms of how the company's leadership manages climate-related risks and opportunities, and how these factors feed into the company's strategy. One interesting pronouncement by the SEC chair, and I think somewhat of a disappointment, is that the new SEC rules, while expected to be informed by existing standards, such as the TCFD, they will be separate and distinct from those standards, including standards being developed, as you've just heard, by the IFRS Foundation. Next slide, please. The SEC is also increasing its oversight of ESG investment funds. There is a growing interest, not just in the US, but around the world, in investing in green and sustainable investments and investment funds that explicitly focus on companies with strong ESG metrics. But the SEC is increasingly concerned with the accountability of asset managers who promote ESG-aligned investment products and strategies. As the SEC chair recently noted, there's been a significant growth in the number of funds marketing themselves as green or sustainable, which do not have standardized meanings in the US market. The SEC's heightened focus follows similar action by the EU and the UK, which I think you'll hear more about over the next 2 days. And the areas of regulatory scrutiny that the SEC might adopt would be to challenge the adequacy of existing disclosures around the ESG strategies, ensure that the fund's processes and practices for selecting investments match their disclosures, and very likely examining marketing materials for false and misleading statements. Final slide, please. And so while there's a buzz of activity in Washington, it will not be straightforward. There has been significant pushback voiced by some members of Congress, as well as 2 of the current SEC commissioners, who object to new prescriptive ESG sustainability disclosure requirements. On climate change, they note that moving away from the existing principles-based regime would increase compliance burdens and costs on companies. It could lead to disclosure of detailed but possibly immaterial information. On diversity, there are objections to mandating board composition, particularly through the listing rules of the stock exchanges. So battle lines are being drawn in the US once again, and we expect a lively debate over any new rules that the SEC proposes to mandate sustainability disclosures, and challenges after any rules are adopted. In any event, it appears the SEC is forging ahead on its own, notwithstanding international efforts to develop a single global standard. And without the SEC joining these efforts, it's unclear that a single global standard can actually be achieved. And with that, I'll hand it back to you.
Sarah, I've got a question. Catherine?
Yes, please.
Catherine, I was just wondering how much of the rules are likely to have foreign private issuer exemptions?
That is a very good question, and it is one that the SEC does grapple with each time it proposes rule disclosures. A large number of non-US companies are registered with the SEC and listed on US stock exchanges. And many of those companies are already following home country requirements, and as you'll see, will be following international developments. I think there's a very real likelihood that the SEC will think carefully about foreign private issuers. Unlikely there'll be a specific exemption for them, but more likely there'll be a series of concessions and perhaps permissions to follow different standards which are applicable in their home market. We've seen the SEC do that in other areas. So space to watch.
Okay, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Tanya. And I'd like to start by congratulating you on curating and organizing this amazing program over the next 2 days. And I'm very honored to be part of this fantastic event. I'm Jennifer Rietbergen. I'm a senior advisor to the Responsible Mining Foundation, and I've been asked to speak about RMF's work in encouraging continuous improvement in responsible extractives. So
Sorry to interrupt, Jennifer. It hasn't gone into presentation mode yet. Would you press it again, please?
That's interesting. So it shows on my screen as being presentation mode. One second. Is it still not showing in presentation mode?
Still not presentation mode.
Mm-hmm.
Jennifer, change it to slideshow.
It's actually on slideshow on my screen, but
maybe unshare it and reshare it again.
I'm going to end slideshow and start it again. So is that better now?
And now it's showing your, it was showing your notes page.
If you're using 2 screens, it sometimes does this. So if you are using 2 screens, just move it all to the main screen.
Mm-hmm. That might be beyond my technical capabilities.
just shut down your PowerPoint and restart PowerPoint.
I think what I'm going to do is shut down the big screen, switch to this one, and hopefully that's it. No?
You need to share your screen again.
Any luck?
It's starting to come through. It's there. Now put it in presentation mode or slideshow mode.
Yeah, I've done that.
We'll just continue on with it like that. We can see it reasonably well.
Okay, sorry about that. So I just wanted to start by saying that Responsible Mining Foundation, or RMF, is an independent research organization established in 2015, based in Switzerland and funded by the current three funders you see at the bottom there. Maybe you don't, but it's the Swiss and Dutch governments and a private philanthropic foundation. RMF's overall vision is that responsible mining, and indeed responsible extractives value chains more generally, benefit the economies, improve the lives of peoples, and respect the environments of producing countries, while at the same time allowing companies and their investors to make a fair and viable return. And given that the extractives industry plays an important role in many resource-rich, lower-income countries, this vision, which predates the Sustainable Development Goals, actually aligns well with these global goals. And RMF's research frameworks cover the usual ESG issues, plus an extra E, precisely to look at the potential contribution that the industry can make to sustainable, broad-based economic development in producing countries. To encourage continuous improvement in how companies manage these ESG issues, RMF undertakes two parallel and complementary work programs, one focused on research and the other on stakeholder engagement. And to give you some examples of these, RMF produces the biennial Responsible Mining Index, or RMI reports, which assess large-scale mining companies across these 6 thematic areas, plus these 3 transversal issues which tend to cut across all of RMF's research frameworks, i.e. gender, human rights, and climate change.
Jennifer, are we still on slide 1? Because on the screen is still slide 1.
Oh dear.
There we go. It's now popped across to your slide 8.
It switches when I press the screen share, the slideshow, it switches across to notes. So I'll just have to use it for this one. Is that now on the right slide, at least, slide 8?
Yes, you're on the correct slide.
Okay. So these are the transversal issues that cut across most of RMF's research frameworks. Other research products besides the RMI reports look at particular themes, such as, from left to right here, mine site level ESG disclosure by smaller companies, a regional study on responsible mining in Latin American region, a status update on mining and the SDGs, and a study on ESG due diligence and transparency among companies trading in metals, minerals, oil and gas. We're also currently preparing a new report on the harmful impacts of mining, based on recent evidence and examples of how large-scale mining companies have caused or contributed to severe impacts of the kinds shown here. Another output is RMF's mine site assessment tool. Now, for some time, mining affected groups had been asking RMF to produce a much simplified version of its framework to assess mining companies. So in response to this demand, RMF published just last year this simple survey tool designed to act as an entry point for local stakeholders to assess and engage with mining operations on issues of direct importance to their lives and livelihoods. This tool has actually proven very popular and has been used in about 10 different countries by local civil society organizations and mining affected communities. This photograph shows the tool being introduced to members of a community in Ghana, who then used the tool to talk with the management of a local mine site. And encouragingly, in a number of cases, the tool has proven effective in helping to start a constructive dialogue between mining operations and affected groups, where there had previously been conflict or simply no communication. One of the great things about the tool is that it enables RMF to help drive improvement at the local level, and often in the context of small mining operations, which we would otherwise not have been able to reach. RMF also produces regular web events and short opinion pieces called Research Insights, based on its research data. These cover a wide range of topics, including a few of the examples shown here: gender and mining, human rights defenders, and world heritage affected by mining. Stepping back now to look at how RMF does what it does, the overall approach of the Foundation seeks to maximize impact by basing its assessment on society expectations of the industry, seeking to level the playing field between different types of companies and different jurisdictions, encouraging continuous improvement by taking a constructive yet critical approach to its engagement with companies, highlighting leading practice and supporting industry-wide learning, emphasizing the importance of asset-level data, i.e. public interest data that is disaggregated to the level of individual mine sites, working in an inclusive and complementary manner with other groups, and finally supporting the operationalization of the open data principles. In the interest of time, I will not go through all of these, but just to touch on some. How does RMF articulate society expectations? Well, this is based on several rounds of consultations and discussions with a wide range of stakeholders, including mining affected communities, civil society, labor unions, investors, governments, academia, companies, industry bodies, and others. This map shows the countries where we held regional consultations to hear firsthand about the issues that stakeholders see as important for RMF to address in its work. And how does RMF seek to level the playing field? Well, essentially by covering a wide range of companies and countries in its assessments. This rather complicated slide shows the scope of the RMI Report 2020, which covers 38 large-scale mining companies, including publicly listed and private companies, as well as state-owned enterprises. Together, these companies represent nearly 30% of global mining production, and they account for over 1,000 mine sites in about 55 different producing countries. And by assessing these companies against the same expectations, no matter what type of company they are and no matter where they are operating, RMF can help level the playing field across different geographies and among different segments of the industry. To zoom in on South Africa for a moment, the RMI Report 2020 covers these companies operating a total of 60 mine sites in the country. And the red dots there show the 12 South African mine sites that are addressed as samples of how these companies are applying their corporate standards across their operations. Then to the real crux of the matter, how does RMF encourage continuous improvement? Firstly, by highlighting the considerable room for improvement. This chart shows the overall results on environmental responsibility from the RMI Report 2020, with each bar representing one of the 38 companies assessed, and the blue bars show the companies operating in South Africa. And while companies tend to focus on their horizontal position in the ranking chart, RMF emphasizes the vertical gap between the company performances and society expectations. As you can see, this gap is considerable and it is similar across all thematic areas. Secondly, RMF encourages continuous improvement by identifying and highlighting examples of leading practice. This chart shows the results on economic development, with flags representing which companies were found to have demonstrated a leading practice of some kind. As you can see, it's not necessarily the best performing companies that show leading practices, and RMF produces short descriptions of all leading practices on its website. And about 70 practices have been identified and developed so far. Companies have told us that they find these one of the most useful parts of the RMI reports. Another resource that companies have mentioned as useful is the source document library that accompanies the RMI reports. This fully searchable library contains about 3,800 public domain documents that RMF has sourced and scrutinized in the assessment. So, for example, users can see what a comprehensive human rights policy or mine closure standard can look like. And I should say that all of these resources on the website are freely available to anybody. There is no paying requirement whatsoever. And they're available also in multiple languages. Let's look at a few of the signs. Oh, sorry, one second. Finally, RMF encourages continuous improvement by making all its material available in multiple languages to reach as wide an audience as possible. This includes, for example, the RMI framework, which is widely used by investors and financiers to guide their engagement with mining companies on ESG issues. Now let's look at a few of the signs that RMF's work is having a positive impact on company policies and practices. First, if we compare the overall results seen in the RMI reports 2018 and 2020, we can see if improvements have been made during the intervening 2 years. Here you see in white the overall results in the RMI 2018 report. And here in blue are the overall results in the 2020 report. As you can see, nearly all the companies show a slight improvement, and together they show an average improvement of 17%. Importantly, these improvements are seen across all performance levels, including the weaker performers on the right-hand side of the chart. Of course, it's not possible to prove that RMF has helped drive these improvements, but companies do report to us that they use the RMI reports to help guide their ESG efforts. And investors also tell us that they use the results to call on companies to improve. And as a result of the RMI reports, the assessed companies have made many more documents available in the public domain. On average, 20% more documents than were previously available publicly from the companies. This represents an important improvement, not only for transparency, but also for accountability and learning. Ultimately, RMF's impact depends in part on the extent to which companies take notice of their results and use them to improve. And here we see that some 80% of companies across all performance levels took advantage of the debrief calls that RMF offers to each company to discuss their results in detail. And in terms of RMF getting its message across more broadly, we can see here the weekly traffic to the RMF websites that average about 6,000 visits per month, with regular peaks coinciding with particular events or publications. Again, the multiple translations are important, as visitors to RMF websites come from nearly every country in the world. Finally, RMF's impacts depend on the ability to collaborate, on its ability to collaborate with others to extend and amplify efforts. To show just 3 examples here, the China Chamber of Commerce of Metals and Minerals Companies requested RMF to produce a Chinese language PowerPoint presentation of the RMI framework that they can use as training material for their member companies. And similarly, an Iranian consultancy collaborated with RMF on a Farsi translation of the RMI framework to use as a capacity building tool for mining companies in Iran. And thirdly, an environmental NGO in Indonesia has been using the RMI framework and the RMI digital platform to do its own assessment of mining companies in the country and to engage with regulators on the results. This is a great example of RMF's multiplier effect at work. So I will wrap up there, and if anyone would like more information, please do get in touch with us.
Yes, hi Jennifer, it's Teresa here from Ubuntu Sustainability. I have a question for you in terms of the excellent work that RMF is doing. How do you bridge the gap between what companies disclose in their publicly available information that they say that they're doing and actually checking things on the ground? Because that's really where these kind of frameworks potentially add the most value or could fall over, because often companies will present information in a certain way, but when you actually get to their sites, you see a picture that's different to the ratings that they've perhaps received on some of these public, scores. So I'd just like your views on that, please. Thanks.
Thanks, Teresa. That's a great question. A couple of things I would say to that. First of all, what we would have considered when we look at company reporting, we've kind of come to the conclusion that companies rarely blatantly lie in their reporting. What they tend to do is be economical with the truth. So companies will not talk about, for example, many of the negative things that are going on in the mine sites where they are operating. They will be much more open and transparent about what the positive things are happening. With that in mind, what we can do is we can publish what we have found and what we assess based on company reporting and make that available to anybody to then take it and go and use it as an accountability tool and check against the company's commitments and standards if they're actually making that happen in practice at a particular mine site. We actually do a mine site assessment part of the RMI report. So most of it looks at company-wide policies and practices. We look at a certain number of mine sites as samples as to see whether companies are applying their standards consistently, and the answer is very much no. There tends to be pockets of good behavior, but not at all applied across their operations. So at least what we can do is help share that information, both at company and mine site level, and then offer it to others to take further. And then, as I mentioned, we're going to do as a kind of complementary and almost like a reverse side of the picture, look not at the positive things that companies are doing, but look at what happens when things go wrong. And that will be the report coming out later this year on the severe adverse impacts of mining, taking the same sample of those 38 companies. Thanks, Teresa.
My name is Jeff Colleen. and I'm the Director of Policy and Programs for the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada, or better known as PDAC. I've been asked to join you today to provide an overview of the association's work in the area of sustainability, and particularly on a foundational PDAC program called E3+, a framework for responsible exploration. So over the next number of minutes, I will talk to you about some of PDAC's overarching strategic goals and advocacy, focusing largely on our E3+ program. I'd like to start with a quick overview of the PDAC itself. We are the national voice of Canada's mineral exploration and development industry, with over 4,400 individual and corporate members from all around the world. Many of you are likely familiar with the PDAC convention held each and every year in early March in Toronto. For the first time in its 89-year history, PDAC 2021 was held entirely virtual, and we hope to have another great show planned for 2022, so stay tuned. What people may be less familiar with is the work we do the other 361 days in the year between each convention, advocating for a competitive and responsible Canadian exploration industry, both at home and abroad. We have a strong team of staff and volunteers who monitor the risks and opportunities facing the industry and guide how PDAC can help the industry respond to challenges. We've outlined at PDAC a number of priority areas to focus our efforts, our advocacy efforts, and our tool development. And those are listed here on screen. You can see access to capital, access to land and skills, responsible exploration, Indigenous affairs, and the mineral industry abroad, how our industry interacts with the rest of the world. Responsible exploration is one of the association's key strategic priorities. Much of the work in PDAC's sustainability program and our CSR, corporate social responsibility work, is done to support our members in their efforts to expand knowledge and skills and improve their performance each and every day. Mineral explorers represent the first stage of industry and tend to set the tone for future activities in a region, particularly in regards to environmental performance, health and safety, and engagement with both rights and stakeholders. So whether companies are actively working on mineral claims in Canada's Nunavut territory, on a traditional Indigenous lands, or in Sierra Leone or in Mexico, it's broadly understood that mineral exploration companies are guests. Government, industry, its investors, and all other stakeholders recognize the importance of this fact. And PDAC resources aim to bolster the capabilities of our members to conduct business responsibly. So PDAC was the first industry association in the world to develop a detailed guidance for companies on how to explore responsibly. E3+, a framework for responsible exploration. PDAC has also undertaken a number of other activities and initiatives to help lead members forward in responsible exploration. We've created a first engagement field guide for explorers, which is a guidance tool to support community engagement efforts. We've developed a field safety pocket guide for use by companies and their employees working in the field. And we've also created tools for Indigenous relations, such as our exploration and mining guide for Indigenous communities, as well as our online capacity support tool. And of course, the programming at our PDAC convention brings companies, communities, governments, civil society, and all others together to discuss key matters, challenges, and leading best practices in industry. Namely, within our convention, the sustainability and Indigenous programs in particular speak to these topics. So PDAC has worked with cohorts like the Mining Association of Canada, the International Council on Mining and Metals, and others on legislation, frameworks, and strategies that help to build robust and transparent mechanisms, including the Extractive Sector Transparency Measures Act, Canada's CSR strategy, and the Canadian Ombudsperson for Responsible Enterprise. Focusing on some of the specifics of our E3+ sustainability framework, there are a number of things that we can really dig into. It did start off with humble beginnings as a tool for environmental stewardship all the way back in 2003. which was called E3. Since the redesign to E3 Plus back in 2008, it has developed into an entire sustainability framework, and it's designed to help industry conduct business in a safe, environmentally and socially responsible manner. E3 Plus can bolster an exploration company's ability to be transparent and accountable in assessing and reducing risks, social and environmental impact mitigation efforts, and in learning a social license to operate. E3 Plus is a voluntary framework, and that has been designed specifically for exploration companies. Given the wide range of company sizes, projects, and jurisdictions in which they work, E3 Plus is meant to be flexible and scalable to suit various circumstances. And fortunately, the entire framework is available online, free of charge at our website, www.pdac.ca. So what's shown here on the slide is a very simple visual representation of the components of the E3 Plus framework. There are 8 principles of E3 Plus, laying out the what we should do. Then there are guidance notes, or why we should commit to these principles. And finally, the various toolkits, which outline how to enact the principles described. As mentioned, the framework begins with 8 principles, and they're shown on screen here. The 8 principles are common to all situations and inform companies about what can be expected from them. Guidance notes accompany and expand upon each principle. They help practitioners with converting the principles into action. They help to define what CSR is for exploration and provide a rationale as to why tangible measures should be applied. For example, the guidelines for environmental protection practices cover corporate and project level considerations, policies and management processes, impact assessment and management, vulnerable environments and diversity, as well as monitoring and reporting. So on the screen here, you can also see there are various areas that are covered within the environmental stewardship toolkit, such as archaeological, site and fish considerations, as well as hazardous materials and reclamation. On screen now, you can see there are some of what is covered within the social responsibility toolkit, including governance, ethical conduct, and human rights. Our health and safety section covers a breadth of different circumstances, as we outlay here on this slide in terms of a number of different topic areas. And in addition to the fulsome health and safety content within E3 Plus, we also produce a field pocket guide in English, French, and Spanish, and that's available free as well for access on the pdac.ca website. PDAC has a commitment to improve its sustainability guidance for members as best practices evolve, and have committed to evolving our toolkits alongside of industry best practices. With this in mind, we have been developing content to increase awareness of the diversity and inclusion issues that are faced in the mineral sector. To support this work, PDAC has established a diversity and inclusion working group in 2018, and it's comprised of individuals from key stakeholder groups. And this working group has served as a leading hub for diversity and inclusion in mineral exploration and mining industries. And it's contributed to guidance development and to help improve performance and practice of mineral exploration and mining in companies abroad. The PDAC Gender and Diversity Inclusion Guidebook for Explorers was finalized and produced in 2019, and it's another tool that is available for free on the PDAC website. We do recognize that gender is only one part of the diversity and inclusion landscape, and in subsequent years, PDAC does aim to continue expanding the available guidance to include other industry relevant topics. Environmental stewardship continues to be a key component as well to earning and maintaining public trust in mineral exploration and in project development. PDAC continues to monitor various aspects of environmental best practices and is looking continuously to incorporate those advances into our environmental stewardship, excellence in environmental stewardship toolkit. Again, a part of our E3+ framework. With respect to reporting mechanisms, PDAC has been working with a number of groups and associations, both in Canada and outside of Canada, to identify some ways in which we may support companies in reporting on sustainability factors at the exploration stage, in particular for mineral developers and mineral explorers. This will be a multi-year effort, given the breadth of sustainability and ESG reporting frameworks that are being implemented and developed in this year in 2020-21. We're also focusing on providing clarity to our members and the applicability of various frameworks. We had a notable amount of content on this topic to inform members at the PDAC 2021 convention, and we will certainly, I anticipate we will have more material around ESG and disclosure practices once again at PDAC 2022, so stay tuned. I wanted to comment just before ending off that PDAC recognized very quickly as the COVID-19 pandemic began to take hold that our members in the industry were facing some unparalleled challenges, and that simply getting out into the field and getting to site may be a very cumbersome task or not even feasible for many. With this in mind, the association, we immediately began to engage with the federal government here in Canada to note the potential impacts on mineral exploration and the primary funding mechanism in Canada, which is the flow-through share regime. We are pleased to see Finance Canada recognize this recommendation and announce deferral of timelines associated with the flow-through share regime in July of 2020. This provided the industry with the financial flexibility needed to respond to the roadblocks really put in place by the pandemic. To help spur recovery from the pandemic, we've also recommended to the federal government that they increase the mineral exploration tax credit for provinces and territories. This is an aim to bolster our competitiveness and attract increased investment for grassroots exploration in Canada, particularly as demand for critical and battery-related minerals is set to climb into the foreseeable future. So as I've mentioned, PDAC's sustainability efforts extend well into our annual convention, and in particular via our sustainability and Indigenous programs. PDAC 2021, as I mentioned, was the very first year that we had a virtual convention, and by most measures, it really was a resounding success. While we're still working to confirm the format for PDAC 2022, applications for some of the program areas are now open, and I encourage you to visit our website to find out more. In addition to the programming I've spoke about here today, I also wanted to note the convention does include a trade show, an investors exchange, capital markets program, a technical program, an extensive list of short courses, and many other networking and social events. So with that, I'd like to end off saying thank you very much for your time, for inviting me to speak today, for your interest in E3+. And I certainly invite you all to visit our website here at www.pdac.ca to review the content in the guidelines, in the framework. And I invite you all to reach out to the association if you have any questions. With that, please have a great day and goodbye.
Thanks. Morning, everybody. Let's hope this screen sharing works as well as it did earlier. You should be able to see my screen.
Yeah, perfectly.
Great, thank you. Okay, so the topic of my presentation is really what is the difference between all these different kind of reports that companies issue on a regular basis. There's ESG reports, there's competent persons reports, integrated annual reports. What is the difference? Okay, move, there we go. So to start with, what is sustainability reporting? And we heard in some of the presentations earlier on about some of the frameworks that are used to produce sustainability reports. And we've also heard that sustainability reporting is not mandatory in many jurisdictions. So it's really voluntary reporting. It's aimed at external and internal stakeholders. These reports are usually issued annually. They focus on economic, environmental, and social impacts and performance. Some companies link them to their contributions to the achievement of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. They can include disclosure of financial or financially material information to inform investor decision makings. As I said earlier, in South Africa, it's not mandatory. There's no JSE requirement, for example. So these reports are voluntary. And interchangeably, sustainability reporting is referred to as ESG reporting. So it's really sort of one and the same. Why do companies issue these reports if it's voluntary? Well, largely because investors are demanding this information. So if investors have access to the information, it boosts their confidence in the company, and they're able to attract more investment, which ultimately gives them a competitive advantage. It demonstrates the organization's commitment to managing these sustainability risks. It helps companies be prepared for new regulation, because often regulation sort of comes and follows what the rest of the stakeholders in society is demanding. It helps them track and manage their sustainability performance. And importantly, it also helps proactively identify risks and opportunities and helps organizations manage these. What's normally contained in a sustainability report? Well, it's a mixture of qualitative and quantitative information. And the SEC presentation earlier on spoke nicely to what kind of information from a climate-related perspective this could look like. It's usually aligned to a framework or standard, and I'll explain the difference just now. Sustainability reports are based on the premise that there's various forms of capital that are impacted by an organization's activities, and these activities can result in creation, preservation, or erosion of these various forms of capital. And I'll illustrate that just now. Ideally, sustainability reports are assured by some kind of independent party, which gives validity to the statements that are being made and the accuracy of the data that's presented. And the emphasis is and should be on the materiality of the information or the impacts to the organization. So you may have the organization may have a very low financial interest in an asset, but there may be material sustainability impacts that it would then disclose or should disclose in its sustainability report. This gives you an overview of the capitals I mentioned earlier on. So on the left-hand side, there's a range of capitals that are used for the organization to be able to function, whether it's the natural capital, the water that it requires, or the land that is needed to host the operations, financial capital in the form of funding, intellectual capital from the people working for it. All of that comes together to do what the business needs to do. And at the end of the day, there are impacts on these forms of capital. So whether it's water pollution or a greenhouse gas intervention through planting trees to contribute to the management of CO2, whether it's returns of profits to shareholders, improved skills of the employees, all these forms of capital are impacted by what an organization does, and sustainability reports seek to present this information as stakeholders have an idea of how the organization operates and impacts on these various capitals. I've mentioned before that typically sustainability reporting is prepared in line with a framework or a standard. Frameworks are sort of overarching documents that are principles-based, that talk to how an organization should structure its information, what it should talk to, and how it should prepare that information. Standards are more specific, and the idea of standard is that it would be replicable and directly comparable between similar organizations. The standards make the frameworks actionable, and hopefully over time ensure this consistency, comparability, and reliability of the disclosures that companies issue. And examples of some of these standards and frameworks, you've heard mention of them previously this morning. The GRI is sort of the original sustainability reporting standard. It has a series of standards covering a range of different topics. It's adopted by the UN Global Compact, so many organizations who are affiliated with the Global Compact issued GRI aligned sustainability reports. It has principles informing what the content of these reports should look like, and that's based on materiality and transparency. And it's got various indicators. Either you can report in line with the core sort of minimum reporting indicators or complete reporting. SASB is the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. Again, these are standards around the disclosure of financially material information to help inform investor decision making. And there's sort of 77 standards that they produce for a range of industries. The Carbon Disclosure Project, CDP, started out as really just disclosure of carbon information. They now have disclosures in terms of water and forests. They score the ratings or score the submissions that people or that organizations provide to them, and you can get a D- up to an A. And there's various questionnaires, either a full or minimum version, and they encourage disclosures by all kinds of organizations. So even cities, for example, will produce a CDP report. The TCFD is related to climate-related financial information. And again, it's investors seeking to assess whether or not, or to the extent to which companies understand their climate risks and what that could mean for the financial performance of companies in the long term. So that's just a flavor of some of these sustainability reports. So then what's the difference between all of this and these competent persons reports and the JSE annual financial reports, integrated reports? What I've tried to present in these slides is a summary of very complicated information. Well, it's voluminous in terms of trying to describe exactly what each of these reports aims to achieve. So if we just look at from SAM codes in terms of a competent persons report, which would include a competent valuator report, these reports are really around specific topics. So it's the mineral assets of that particular organization. It's aimed at external stakeholders, largely at the investors. The scope of the report is driven by materiality considerations. And there's both a legal and a demand driver for these reports. So if you're a mining company listed on the JSE, then there's a legal driver for it. And why does the JSE ask you to prepare these reports? Well, because investors want it. So there's sort of that double link. And these reports are issued proactively. So I realize the term frequency here may not be the best description, but what I've tried to describe on this final category is, are these reports issued on a routine basis, or are they issued in advance of something? And, you know, competent persons reports are listed or produced, for example, at a company listing to try and attract investments. So I consider them to be proactive kinds of reports. In terms of the JSE annual report, obviously there's mineral resource and mineral reserve annual reporting requirements as well, but I wanted to just focus here on really the company specific annual reporting that would be of application to both mineral companies and to external stakeholders. So these annual financial reports they include selected topics. They are aimed at external stakeholders. They talk to both material. Sorry, I ended up pressing mute by mistake. So these annual reports talk to materiality and the level of economic interest that a company has. There's both, again, a legal and a demand driver, and these annual reports are routine. They need to happen every year within a certain period of the financial year end of that company. Integrated reports, in terms of the integrated reporting framework, these really try to bring everything together. And there's a distinction between a truly integrated report and just a consolidated report, because integrated reporting talks to really the merger of various topics which often are reported on in silos. And it talks to integrated thinking by the business to understand what its company is doing in terms of all those capitals that I described earlier. So it really covers all topics. It's addressing all stakeholder needs, focused, or the scope again is really driven by materiality. It's a voluntary process, and it can be both routine and proactive in nature. The sustainability reports, very similar in a way to the integrated reports. They should cover all applicable topics from financial through to ESG, talking to all stakeholders in terms of aspects that are material to them. It's demanded by investors, but is still voluntary in most jurisdictions at this stage, and again, has both a routine and a proactive component to it. So we can see that there's quite a lot of overlap between these various kinds of reports, but they are serving distinct purposes, and in instances are talking to specific audiences about specific things. The challenge for mineral companies is to try and understand this landscape and come up with a way of integrating it all together, which is why the integrated reporting framework exists, to try and say, well, you need to understand what is the golden thread for your story and draw the line between all, effectively what could be chapters of a large integrated report. But individually, these kinds of reports serve specific purposes, and one cannot replace the other. A competent person's report cannot replace a sustainability report, and vice versa. I'm happy to take any questions.
Teresa, it's Kelly here.
Hi, Kelly.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Just in terms of your discussion, I mean, in terms of the JSE, because in SAMVAL we actually added in the table 1, so under table T1.10, we actually have included that you need to take into account SAMESC. We did actually give the alternative to use other recognized codes like the Equator Principle. But in essence, the fact that it's actually included in table 1, which is mandatory under SAMVAL, means that in terms of the JSE, companies, CPRs and integrated annual reports do have to take it into account.
Yeah, thanks,
because
Kelly.
in terms of JSE, in terms of section 12 of the JSE, they have to comply with SAMVAL and SAMREC. So under those circumstances, they do have to be taken into account.
True, and you'll notice that it was with great restraint that I didn't delve into the world of SAMESC in this presentation. Tanya's been keeping me on a very tight leash, but I share your sentiment in terms of that link. And so, yes, I think the conversation around where SAMESC sits and the need that it should fulfill obviously is one of the aims as to why this inquisition is taking place, because we're looking for guidance on what it should be. But I think just as a summary now is that SAMESC can't and shouldn't replace sustainability reporting, just in my opinion. There's a lot of overlap and a lot of information that SAMESC talks to that draws on what would go into a sustainability report, but it obviously has quite a specific mandate in terms of talking to the SAM codes.
Hi, Teresa, it's Maria here.
Hi, Maria.
All right, so I think my sort of concern will, I think, come out of the next few presentations, and then by the end of tomorrow, I see we're going to chat about it quite a lot, and it relates to the discussion now that you've just touched on with SAMVAL. That's that whole integrating the SAM ESG into the SAMVAL as well as the SAMREC table 1. And sort of I'm struggling to understand, in terms of that slide that you showed earlier with the purpose and everything of the CPRs versus the integrated reports and the JSE annual reports. And with the SAMREC CPRs, I think you specifically highlighted that it's a specific topic. And what I would really like to see come out of these sort of next 2 days is to understand how, because the ESG portion, in my opinion, is so broad, how exactly that fits into a specific topic, if that specific topic of a CPR is reporting a mineral asset.
Maria, yes, very valid question, and I think it's a very common question in the industry. Again, hence why this inquisition is taking place. And certainly it's something that SAMESC does need to make a lot clearer, because again, SAMESC has a very specific mandate in terms of understanding how ESG impacts on the declaration of mineral resources and mineral reserves. And it sounds quite simple, but that's a very, very massive undertaking. So thanks for that question. I think many people share your concern and your uncertainty.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to chat to you. I'm going to go through a few aspects of ESG reporting as it refers to the codes in general. Just to start by saying that CRISCO doesn't have a specific perspective on ESG. It's part of a reporting system. And as we go through, you'll see some of the aspects that that we consider important. Just to kick off, one of the aspects of CRISCO is that we have a very strong relationship with ICMM. And this is I'm just going to show you two graphs quickly from a recent ICMM report, which looks at MDCs, mineral dependent countries, and how they performed in a socioeconomic perspective. So in this diagram, socioeconomic index is on the left, and how countries have improved is on the x-axis. You can see South Africa right here in the middle, catching up. Australia is obviously high up, and countries like the US and the UK aren't on this diagram, obviously, because they're not mineral dependent countries. But important aspect is that South Africa isn't right here, lagging with the DRC and Zambia is. So that's a good start for us as a country. Looking at the similar diagram, this is a comparison of the socioeconomic score versus the resource governance score, and there's a very strong correlation. You can see that South Africa is right up here, very close to sort of average, but right on the in the right area. Once again, good that we're not here at the bottom. So I think that as a country, we can be very, very happy that we're actually moving in the right direction. The unfortunate thing is that this comment also came in their document. And it says, our findings suggest that MDCs, those whose social progress is lagging, tend to suffer from political instability or violence, corruption, lack of transparency and accountability, or suppressed civil society voice. And we've seen quite a few of those things in the recent past. When adequately governed, minerals development can contribute to a wide range of policy objectives beyond just revenue generation, such as job creation, poverty reduction, improved energy and manufacturing, and generation of foreign direct investment. So these topics that we're talking about today are really important, and they're important in a greater sense in our society. Just to put a little bit of where the CRISCO codes come into their reach, the area that I've highlighted in blue is very definitely the area that we operate in. So we operate right at the beginning. So it's before the construction and before operation. So we've got to be mindful that when we apply ESG principles, that we are applying them early on, and that we're not responsible for how they are implemented when a mine is actually in operation. Just to bring a slightly different perspective, these are four aspects that we might consider when we're looking at ESG aspects. The stewardship of the earth and its resources, the build trust of a local community, providing transparency to inform decision, or attracting investment. And I think one of the things that I would put out there is that we've got to be careful that what we do in the compliance space is that we concentrate on the last point, attracting investment, when we should actually be concentrating on the first two. And in fact, if you look at them in a timeline, the stewardship comes before, building the trust in the community comes next, and then attracting investments comes at the end. So if we're going to do the ESG, making sure that we are compliant and that we are doing the right things, it's there for those first two aspects and not primarily for the last one. Here's a list of numerous aspects of environmental and social and governance aspects, and each one we feel that we have to address. And we've already come up in discussion and saying some of this is just too much for us to handle. So we've got to be quite careful in exactly how we address, what we address, and how we address it. And going on from that, we must understand that each mine is different. Here I've got pictures of open cast mines, coal mines, logistics, and the bottom right-hand one is an iron ore mine. So each one of these has different ESG requirements, and each one that we deal with in a compliance perspective for mineral reporting has a different stage. It could be project stage, could be implementation, it could be operation, it could even be closure. But all of those have very different aspects of consideration, and they're not necessarily covered by exactly the same approach each time. Once again, this is just providing in a pictorial form the different aspects of ESG that we see: water, biodiversity, energy, tailings or waste disposal, the community, and what we do with closure. So each one of those needs to be addressed separately and not necessarily exactly the same. Now, this is the ICMM list of principles or aspects. And once, just as we've discussed earlier today, there are numerous of these. And if we start getting into all of them, it could be extremely difficult to balance them and make sure that we do each one of them justice. So we've got to be quite careful how we approach them. Having said that, in the minerals reporting, we've already included environmental and social aspects as part of the modifying factors. So this is not something new. Yes, the application might require a bit more attention or a new perspective, but it's been part of the reporting system from a long time ago. Once again, sustainability has been discussed, so I'm not going to belabor the point. Importantly, we're interacting with communities and environment, and we need to make sure that we are doing exactly what is required, which is in the benefit of the planet, not only of the investors. Similarly, with the social licensing to operate, we need to make sure that we've gained the trust of the community, that we've created the right environment so that we can have a winning situation for both the community and for the mining operation when it occurs. Having said that, the codes aren't there to police what actually happens in the operation. They're helping to show what's feasible and making sure that these things are attended to early on in a proactive way. The CRISCO has a template, which is all the aspects of the codes that should be included. And included in that is a discussion about environmental issues, about waste and tailings, about permitting, about the interaction with the community, as well as mine closure, the operating requirements for hazardous materials, which are common in mines, issues of energy and energy consumption, as well as making sure that we've addressed all the potential impacts that might be there. So that's a very brief request or part of the CRISCO requirements, but it's there. And it may need to be fleshed out, but it's important that it's not something that has been left out. It needs to be attended to for sure. And the CRISCO principles include transparency, materiality, and competence. And obviously in ESG context, these first two, transparency and materiality, are critical. So where do we go from here? So CRISCO provides governance. So in the G perspective of ESG, CRISCO helps to provide governance in the reporting of mineral resources and reserves. So we're right there at the beginning to provide that. We not primarily, the area of influence is in mineral resources and reserves and the interaction with potential investors. So it's a very long-term perspective that we've got. Just remind you of this, we need to make sure that whatever we're doing in the environmental, social, and governance aspect is right for the situation, that it's in the feasibility and the project initiation stage generally, and not in the actual operation stage. So what do we need to see? Well, we probably need to see more direction. Some guidelines, possibly better training of competent persons, and making sure competent persons understand what's there without making them do a complete ESIA or a very significant document, because that's not their area of expertise. and also making sure that where mines make commitments in the mineral resource and reserve reporting, and make commitments right at the beginning that those in some way are implemented, and where they're not, that there's some sort of accountability going forward. Thank you very much. I don't know whether there are any questions.
All right, so good morning, everybody. I trust you can see my screen.
Yes,
And
perfectly.
let me just put on my video so you can see that I'm actually a real person, not a robot. Well, I must say, after having listened to all the much more qualified speakers than me today, I feel like a babe in the woods coming to try and present this little bit on ESG and valuation. But the aspects were discussed are both qualitative and quantitative. And I think I can bring an element of the quantities or the quantitative aspects to ESG and valuation. And that's what I plan to set out as we go forward. Okay, now let's just see how we're going to get this to work. Why is it not going down? Oh, well, that's a good start.
Andy, there are some arrows at the bottom that you can press that will make it go.
Okay, there we go. Got it. Okay, so in my view, the introduction of the Mineral Processing and Resource Development Act of 2002 kind of formalized what ESG obligations there were in South Africa. In particular, there was the Social Labour Plan, which is part of your mining rights application, which set out specific requirements for your local economic development, human resource development, and then also retrenchment reskilling. And the SLP provisions had to be included in the cash flow presented in the mining rights application. And once these documents were submitted and approved, it became a commitment with government. And what often happened is that the targets that companies were including in these documents became quite generous and then also became a burden. So early on, we had put in place a principle which was accepted by the DMR initially of 500,000 Rand per annum or 1% of net profit as an annual SLP provision. And that was accepted initially. Then, of course, there's the closure aspects. And the DMR requires the closure fund to be created so that they don't left with a mine that ends and there's no money to close it. So there are three generally accepted ways of creating a fund. So it's either annual payments into a trust fund, bank guarantees, or insurance type policy. Now there's differences between these because the first two are controlled by the DMR, the DMRE. So any release of funds out of those is controlled by them, whereas the insurance type policy is largely controlled by the company. And another problem with environmental closure costs is often companies only provide these funds in the later years of the life of mine. So in the event of a sale of a mine, which we've seen in many instances, the closure fund may be too low. And a coal mine sold about 10 years ago, the selling company had to inject 750 million Rand into the closure fund so that it was adequately funded. And a generally accepted provision concept is that the closure fund should be sufficient for immediate closure in today's terms and not based on some future value. The other implication too is that often the company has to first incur the rehabilitation costs and then claim them back from one of the funds. So it means you're actually paying for your rehabilitation and closure costs twice, in effect. One of the biggest problems facing mining companies is your post-closure pollution control, particularly regarding water treatment. And often we know of several mines in South Africa where they have had to continue pumping water to surface to keep neighboring mines dry. If they don't do that, then the groundwater levels recharge, and often you then get acid mine drainage decanting into springs, rivers, and lakes, which then requires expensive water treatment to achieve water quality levels that are defined in your water use license. The problem is the duration of the post-closure water treatment is an unknown. So here's an example of the sort of cost you could expect to incur for post-closure water treatment. So there's a capital cost to put in a reverse osmosis plant. And then there's operating costs to run that plant at different levels, depending on as your decant increases and the amount of water that has to be treated increases as well. Now, if you take those costs over, let's say, a 30-year period, you'll see that amounts to 2,000 million rand, 2 billion rand. Now that's a lot of money, but if you look at it as an NPV, it's only 657 million rand. And the further out this goes into the future, that NPV would then reduce. So the problem is you may account for it in your cash flow, but it's so far in the future that it actually has a minimal impact in terms of the overall evaluation of the project. One of the things we have in South Africa is the Mining Charter 3, which was, I think, ratified in 2019-18, thereabouts. And there's a scorecard which is administered by the DMR, which contains these parameters. So there's the ownership, which is your BEE, HDSA, Black Economic Empowerment, mine community development, which is per the SLP, housing living conditions, employment equity procurement, and human resource development. Now, in terms of the scorecard, the minimum required to be compliant with the scorecard is the ring-fenced elements, which are those 3 yes, no rings in red, and then a 50 to 60% score on the other 3 items. Of interest is that the BEE ownership really does not form a valuation aspect at project or mineral asset level, because that is really just how dividend flows would be handled. But if you're looking at the valuation of a project by itself, the ownership is then not an issue. But now have a look and see what the implication of this implementing the scorecard could be. So here's some examples of value. So human resource development is actually stipulated as 5% of payroll. Housing compliance is based on a set of standards as contained in the housing living conditions. And I've seen this applied as 1% of payroll. And then your enterprise supplier development, 70 to 80% of your purchases must be made from BEE companies. And local economic development projects, which is 100% per your SLP commitments. Now, in this instance, these are, so the 1% of payroll, 3% of net profit after tax. These are provisions that were included into a financial evaluation. And then just have a look and see what the impact of all of this is. So a typical life of mine operating cost split for an underground mine. You can see 49% is mining costs, engineering 6%, processing 22%, G&A, corporate overheads 14%. But your SLP, environmental monitoring and closure, so let's say your ESG components, are 9% of OPEX, which is greater than the contingency you normally include in the feasibility study. So if you haven't taken these into account in your cash flow evaluation, you actually then outside of your contingency that you may have applied, and so you would be overstating the values that are coming out. And bear in mind that on top of this is still the royalty cost between 5 and 7% maximum that you would have to pay on your profit, your gross revenue. Now, in the SAMES guidelines, they have this definition of governance for a company. And it all talks about board structure, diversity, executive pay, shareholder rights, disclosure of information, risk management, etc. Now, the question I have is, how do you measure or rate these and attach a cost implication that, as far as doing evaluation of a company is concerned? Further in the definitions, there's the United Nations Corporate Sustainable Development Indicators, which have been mentioned before. And I just pulled out some of those. So that highlighted poverty, governance, health, education, atmosphere, water, etc. Now, some of those we are attending to already by virtue of the mining charter, your EMPs, the carbon taxes, climate change, greenhouse gas monitoring, occupational health, housing provision. But the governance is not really a measurable aspect. But then, of course, we have seen lots of governance shortcomings when you look at some of the companies that have been on our economic headlines over the last few years, all where they had shortcomings in their governance aspects. But again, how do you measure that? How do you rate that from a valuation perspective? Now, it's fortuitous that, seeing as I'm talking in the JSE slot, that I actually had pulled up this particular picture from a presentation that a Ms. Subramani from the JSE had done a few years ago. And it's based on the FTSE Russell's ESG ratings data model. I don't for 1 minute understand that I know how to explain this. I'm just showing it. But what it does show is that the JSE has been monitoring ESG aspects for at least 5 years now, and uses this method to assess companies' ESG reporting. And the key takeaway from this particular
I think that Andy has frozen. I hope that his internet reboots and he's able to come back online. But I think that's what we're dealing with at the moment.
sorry, Mike, did everybody get that? I seem to.
Unfortunately, we lost you, Andy.
Where did you lose me about?
Just sort of talking around the ESG and the JSE setting.
Okay, so we were on this slide.
That's correct.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it might have been my internet suddenly just had a blip. So let me just get this out the way. Yeah, so this is up, I got off the JSE website. And according to what I saw, they have been monitoring ESG disclosure in a company's annual reports now for several years using this process. I do not for 1 minute understand how to apply it, but I'll leave that over to the clever people. But in picking up what people have said up to now, I think the last item down here is particularly pertinent, and that is for disclosure in ESG matters is to tell a credible story to stakeholders in a mistrustful society. So it's all about transparency, which is one of the keystones of our reporting requirements, is transparent to be what you're saying, and so people can understand what you're saying as well. And that's all I have to say. Any questions?
Andy, hi, good day. It's Bruce Williamson here.
Hey, Bruce.
Yeah, just to your knowledge, say over the last 15, 20 years in South Africa, how many companies have applied for closure licenses and how many have actually been given their closure certificates?
Bruce, to be honest, I don't know how many in either case, but if I had to hazard a guess, it's probably 1 or 2 closure certificates that have been granted, because they're just not prepared to walk away from allow the company to walk away from their obligations.
Yeah,
I know years ago when I was with Corabrick, we had applied for a closure certificate for one of the brick quarries, and it took us about 3 years to eventually get it done after extensive rehabilitation. But that was a long time ago. I'm not aware of many closure certificates that have been issued now, and I don't know if any of the environmental people on the call would know that.
Yeah, because I mean, it's a big concern for investors. It's all well and good to start at the exploration side and we do everything right, and then we lose our way, and there's a lot of these untied loose ends, and suddenly you're sitting with a company that it nosedives because you can't close the thing.
Exactly, and as I was pointing out, with these post-closure water monitoring costs, you don't know how long those are going to go on for. Could be for forever. And how do you fund it?
Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you very much.
Andy, while you were speaking, I'm not sure if you saw the comments on the chat, but Oliver Barker said, "Hi, Andy. I remain concerned that cumulative impacts are not being incorporated into new operations, especially in the highly developed coal fields such as the Ermelo area, for an example. The cumulative impacts in the Wits are also an example of this kind. Your comments, please."
Yeah. Hi, Oliver. Yes, thank you. Well, for any operating mine, there's several things that have to be established. Number one is your baseline environmental conditions. Number two, what aspects of the environmental impact you are creating, and two, evaluate the cumulative impacts from all of those various companies around you. But if you haven't got your baseline set up correctly and you know what your own impacts are, you could end up being responsible for other companies' environmental impacts. So it's a very, very critical component of environmental impact assessment, is to have your baseline properly recorded and know what your own impacts are, that you can mitigate those correctly.
Hi, thank you. My comment is on the closure. So the closure applications, though they are processed by the DMR. However, DMR depends on or solicit comments from other departments such as water and environment departments. Now, if those departments do not support the closure, then that becomes a reason for why closure are not granted by the DMR.
Yeah, Sunday, you're quite right. But at the end of the day, towards the end of a mine life, there has to be a formal closure plan created, which has to be, as I understand it, approved by both yourselves and the Department of Environment. And that then becomes the measure against which the closure activities have to be carried out. And providing you then carry out all of the activities that, according to what you said you would do, there should then be no restriction in terms of getting a closure certificate granted.
All right, thank you. And to Tanya and everyone in the organizing team for giving me the opportunity to present in this webinar. So I'll be looking at the regulator's view, which is the DMR on ESG, on ESGs. But this would take the following shape. It would not be, as my colleagues have, as the previous presenters have looked at, mine would look at more into the view of the MPRDA. So the content, I'll start with the impacts of mining, environmental and social aspects, importance of environment and social development, compliance and reporting, importance of ESGs, and in closing remarks would be the ESG disclosure. Now, the regulator appreciate that the South African economy has benefited immensely from mining through extraction of minerals for both export and local consumption, and by secondary industries as well. Now, notwithstanding the socio-economic benefit, legacy mining has left huge voids, shafts, and volumes of residues unrehabilitated, which then causes negative environmental and social impacts for surrounding communities, which we have seen from complaints. More particularly, Johannesburg is one of the examples of shafts and mine dumps causing dumps and so on. In excuse, this happened due to lack of legislation for sustainable development in the past regulations, particularly for mine closure. So the regulator then introduced environmental management and mine closure into legislation for the first time in the 1991 Minerals Act, wherein mines were required to conduct impact assessments and provide EMPs. Now, that was also followed by the introduction of the social development aspect following the World Summit on Sustainable Development, which was held in South Africa, wherein mines were required to develop social and labor plans, and that was also followed by the Mining Charter. The social development aspects enable communities which have been neglected for decades to derive benefits from mining activities and ensure sustainable development for current and post-mine closure. So in 2014, the regulator repealed the environmental management sections in the MPRDA and replaced it with the NEMA, the National Environmental Management Act of 1998, to give effect to a common environmental legislation in the country in line with international environmental laws, because this came after complaints that the environmental management sections and the implementation thereof from the MPRDA are substandard. This came from the public and other departments that were dealing with the National Environmental Management Act. Mines are required to conduct needs assessment for communities in line with best international practices in order to uplift host communities who have been for long raising complaints to the regulator for being left out of the benefits of mining. Now, mineral rights holders, this would then include mining, prospecting rights and mining rights, to some extent, mining permits as well, and prospecting plans are required to submit annual reports detailing accurate information and data in respect of mineral reserves and resources, together with audited financial statements regarding their mining operations. Further, mineral rights holders and operators are required to report annually on their performance in the areas of environmental management and social development in relation to the SLP's mining charter as mandated, and corporate social investment contributions where there are such contributions. In pursuit of promoting an inclusive mining sector and addressing past social imbalances, the regulator expects mines to do more as responsible corporate citizens over and above the minimum requirements for compliance, not just a ticking box, but comply with the spirit of sustainable development. Whereas mineral rights holders and operators may report compliance in this regard, we have seen a number of complaints echoing unhappiness about surrounding operations. Indicates that, so this indicates that often mines do not accurately report on their performance on sustainable development. As I said earlier, they just do a compliance exercise, a box ticking exercise. Now, where communities show to be relatively at peace with mining operations, in most instances, the regulator has found this to be in operations with continuous engagement and more disclosure to communities on their environmental and social performance where they operate, notwithstanding other social issues such as high unemployment and criminal elements. So this, what says is that in most of the communities that there is relatively peace, it's because the community feel involved and engaged in the operations. They understand that their role, and often they don't expect that mine will be the panacea of all the social ills, but the little engagement that they have and the education, at least it brings some level of peace between the community and the mining operations. For the South African mining industry, sound socio-economic disclosure is key for demonstrating how mining houses are aligning their business models with growing concern about pollution, scarcity of natural resources, and loss of biodiversity, which my colleagues, previous presenters, have already dealt on this in detail. Since the mining sector is one of the largest employers in South Africa, how mining companies empower their employees, how they contribute to socio-economic upliftment of communities, and how they communicate this information to all stakeholders and disclose in their reports is critical for the credibility of the entire mining industry. Environmental and socio-economic integrated disclosures are now becoming more important for mining companies' survival and minimizing disruptions in their operations, as investors are increasingly interested in making sure their investments align with compliance requirements and the values held by international community towards the environment and society. This is more important given the country's history and high levels of economic inequalities, especially taking lessons from the tragedy of Marikana, where several workers died in an industrial unrest, which resulted from socio-economic challenges. In closing remarks, in order to give effect to the object of MPRDA in realizing sustainable development in the mining industry, the regulator is of the view that this is important for mine operators in their different sizes to transparently report on their environmental, social, and economic performance as responsible corporate citizens for sustainable growth of the industry. I thank you. And questions and discussion if there's still time.
Okay, well, just hi everybody, and thanks to Tanya, Sarah for hosting today and tomorrow. And yeah, just great to be part of this. Well, I sense that we've got a lot to sort out ahead of us, but let's get going. So what I've been asked to do is just to look at it from an investment and an investor viewpoint is, and what the users of these mineral reserve and resource reports think. So you can see I've listed sort of from the investor perspective, there's a short list of companies that typically are doing M&A or investment in one form or the other. Now I'm just going to focus for today on what we call the buy and the sell side stock market investors. Those are the large institutions, Sanlam's, Old Mutual, Allan Gray, Coronation, 91 Asset Management. Plus there are many boutique fund managers. And then on the other side, and these are maybe the more dedicated users, are the sell side stockbroking analysts. Now they typically will probably have mining related resource skills and are therefore much better positioned to understand the mineral reserve and resource reports. Understand that I mean, one of the failings, I guess, in our market, if you look at the market capitalization of the resources compared to how are we represented in terms of skills within the investment world, we're very, very underrepresented. And we're dominated by accountants, CFAs, who don't necessarily always understand the finer issues that go around reserve and resource reporting. Next slide. Right, so what I did over the last 10 days was just to approach a number of fund manager analysts within the institutional side and within the stockbroking side. And I mean, really, you can read through some of these. These are direct comments that people gave me when I questioned what value and what use they got out of the reports. And I think we need to acknowledge, and they did acknowledge, that there's been a huge improvement over years in the reporting. Reporting generally is very comprehensive. And you can see some of the reports is that this is the only area where you can get a lot of public domain information to do life of mine type of modeling. And then one of the other points that I'm going to harp on a little bit is it's not always easy to understand the conversion rate from resources to reserves. And then also this whole notion of resources or reserves that are included that sit beyond the infrastructure or the current infrastructure of the mine. Okay, so in using these reports, what are the main goals? So the main goal of the analysts, and I'm in particular talking about the stockbroking analysts, who are the dedicated users, they use these reports to try and put a valuation on the listed companies. So what they need to do is to extract enough information. They generate life of mine net present values. I mean, some of them will also add IRRs, free cash flows. If there's a new project that's tagged on or a new mine listed, obviously that would help in understanding project payback periods. And then another data point that people look at is market capitalization per ounce. And I've put a question mark at the back because when I asked them, well, what ounces do you use? There were sort of diverse answers. Some said, well, we can only stick to reserves. Others said, well, we can't take all the resources into account, but we'll try and take some of them in. So you can see clearly what happens then is you're going to get very, very different answers. And this is the sort of gray area that I think the people that are putting these documents together need to try and put themselves in the place of an analyst on the outside. And how are we going to get recognized? How's the mine going to get recognized properly for the resources, the infrastructure, and the potential cash flows? So at the end of the day, there's a huge reliance on the annual ounces that are going to be produced and the number of years of life that is then assumed. And so we come back to this point, is it's all about the conversion of resources to reserves, and any hesitancy to include resources will impact negatively on your market valuation. Next slide. Okay, so it's also just worth noting how corporate structures have changed. If we go back to 60s, 70s, early 80s, certainly in South Africa, we were blessed with phenomenal ore bodies. We tended to have single lease mines that were listed, many gold, platinum, coal mines, tin mines, asbestos mines, and these had really, really long lives. You could recognize the long life, and the big focus was on paying out really good dividends, interim and final dividends. From the mid-80s onwards, we tended to move towards diversified, and more recently, a lot of them are globally diversified. And then assessing the mineral reserves and resources of these many, many individual mines becomes pretty difficult. And one of the comments was, well, they tend to pool the reserve resources and it becomes less easy and less meaningful to work out what's going on. But the overall focus remains on trying to determine tons, grade, ounces, and the life of mine. And then I think, as I started off by saying, is people in the industry, and I'm putting my mining hat on my head now, is we need to understand that there's a limited number of investors that really, really understand all the nuances and the problems going around here in order to value mines. Thank you. Next slide. And so, yeah, this is actually what it's all about. Recognize that especially diversifieds that have global operations, difficult for analysts to visit all these mines. So you're continually grappling with the life of mine issue because in your mind, you've got to try and imagine what these mines, what the topography looks like, whether services provided to the mines, access to the mines. And then again, I keep coming back to the point of conversion of resources. And what you can sort of put in the back of your mind is that if you're a mining listed company and your life is sort of heading towards less than 10 years, and that's an arbitrary number that I've picked, is the market will start worrying about your life of mine, and you will find that your valuation is going to be under pressure. Likewise, when you've got more than 20 years, the market doesn't worry too much beyond year 20. And so you can see the bottom part of the points I've made. There are just a myriad of life of mine estimates and assumptions. And what in putting legislation and rules and regulation in place, you've got to continually try to make it easier for investors to understand and be able to generate decent valuations. Okay, and in doing this, I find that less and less companies use side views and 3D views. And given the enormous strides in technology, I would like to see a lot more of these type of slides used in annual reports, in the mineral and reserve and resource documentation. The slide on the left just shows you graphically how you move from an open cast mine, how you access, you can get an idea of the shell, get an idea of the waste that has to be mined, and then how you transition to underground. The one on the right is a very old slide that Goldfields used to put in their annual reports. And those side views, just having shaft and access to the reef plane, were incredibly useful for analysts to understand what you could access, what part of the ore body was accessible. It helped you understand traveling times, traveling distances, which make a big difference on certain mines. So I would urge you, use all that technology and help the investor understand what these ore bodies look like, how they are able to be accessed. If I listen to all the discussion today, we're moving into a far greater area of more subjective issues. And you can see the top 4 points, which is more or less what is being covered in this set of presentations. And being subjective, and I think Andy alluded to a lot of this, is that it's very, very difficult to measure. Now, analysts and fund managers are battling to put hard numbers to the reserve resource. They're going to be even more stretched trying to understand how to price in all of these subjective issues. So, as all I can plead is that the codes need to bring the investors closer to the miners. And then we need to understand what is practical and achievable. If you stretch it too far, investors just move away. They don't see the goals being properly scored, and so they ignore. If there's uncertainty, that implies volatility. Volatility equates to risk for investors, and you find they're just not interested in investing in commodities and resource type stocks. What we've also got to consider is there'll be certain countries that will ignore codes or set lower targets. I think you've also got to consider that total cost to small and mid-tier miners, they may battle a lot to cope with all of this. We're seeing in the Northern Cape, one of the guys trying to reopen the mines there. They're having massive pressure put on them when they're still busy doing exploration. So amongst all of this, we need to find a way of keeping South Africa's miners competitive. Ken showed you where we are sitting. And we're sitting kind of in the middle of a big batch. Being in the middle is okay, but we need, for investors to really trust and want to invest, we need to move into a better position. So keep the miners competitive. I'm urging for a huge amount of education and marketing to the investment community, and that gets miners and investors closer. But then finally, there is no point if miners and investors do not get the government to enact investor-friendly policies. So all of this work is going to be in vain unless we get miners, investors, and government to buy into the same program. And I'd just like to close with a couple of more recent charts. The next one, please. And so this, I just thought being able to analyze the mineral reserve and resource reports accurately, especially helped when looking at the platinum sector. And these were slides I used in presentations a while ago. And really, I think a lot of people, and some of you might not have, you've heard about it, you've half followed it, but we have just been through in the last 3-4 years, probably equates to 2 of the greatest bull markets in PGMs. It's been phenomenal. Now, everyone, I think, a lot of people missed it because they were looking at platinum. Look at the platinum chart on the left-hand side. Until this last little kick up, driven by investors, it wasn't in good shape. It was trending down. Look at palladium. That's where all the action. Go way back to July 2008 is when that bull market started, when they switched and substituted platinum into palladium. And you see, look how palladium went from $500, it peaked at nearly $3,000 an ounce. And that was where you had to be looking. And in fact, it wasn't only palladium you should have been watching, it was rhodium. And so look what's happened to rhodium since 2017. Auto industry could not do without rhodium. There was a huge shortage and it rocketed from $1,000 to, gee, it peaked a little while ago, nearly $30,000 an ounce. So what we found is when analyzing the in situ PGM prill splits is anywhere from 6 to 8% of what is in situ now represents more than 50% of the PGM miners' revenues. And that, all of that, we could understand that because of going through your reports that you guys helped generate. So I'll just leave you in saying fantastic work, keep it up, but we got to get legislation that comes closer to investors. Thank you.
So good afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to try and pull together from an accountant's view some of the presentations and the comments that you've been hearing this morning. And one of the things from an accountant's view is that ESG is not new. It's been in the accounting requirements for more than 25 years. And I think some of the areas where people have been confused is the fact that accountants and competent persons don't necessarily communicate well or speak on the same page. And so to some extent, I'm going to try and highlight some of the risks that a competent person has when they are preparing their reserves and resources report, and why these risks actually impact financial reporting. And actually, it's not then the accountant's problem. It becomes the competent person's problem. So one of the things that I've always tried to highlight, whoops, as I go too fast, is that, oh, come on, accountants are journalists, okay? We're not authors. We report the facts as we see them. We do not create the facts. The facts are all created by others. So the accountant pulls together a vast set of data in order to produce the financial report, and it's not done in isolation. So therefore, when it comes to the reserves and resources report, it's the competent people that are creating the facts. that the accountants then utilize in order to prepare financial reports. So should a competent person make an error by omission or commission when they're preparing their reserves and resources report, that will result in an error in financial reporting. And I'll give some of the obvious ones. There are a lot of less obvious ones as we progress through this short presentation. And these errors generally do arise as a consequence of environmental, social, and governance risks. And particularly, it's the governance one that is the bigger provider of these risks for a competent person when providing information that accountants need. So preparing the financial report, an entity, and by that the entire corporate, has to consider all of the ESG matters. And what are these ESG matters that are important to accountants at a very high level, where the accountant actually relies on the competent person and others in determining these risks? So, a change in environmental regulations. Changes in environmental regulations may have an impact on the declaration of reserves and resources, and the accountant will have no knowledge on environmental regulation changes. He will be expecting that from either a competent person or people within the competent person's department. If there's a license mine condition change, again, the accountant will only have information if that comes to him from the department that's producing the reserves and resources, and it's themselves collecting that information on a license condition change. The entity could have reputational risk from environmental contamination. One of the things that the accountant would also need to learn is if there's been any regulatory reporting or regulatory review or regulatory action against the entity. So that regulatory action may have an impact on the reserves and resource reporting. In the United States, and for entities that are listed in the United States, if an entity receives a fine of $100,000 as a result of an environmental contamination, that's a disclosable event. So the accountant will pick it up at the point in time that it's been paid. But for that probably is too late. And the accountant would need the information that there's been already an action presented by the regulator as an intention to potentially fine the entity. And waiting until the fine has been paid and then the accountant ascertains the information is too late, because there's disclosure issues that are required. And failure to make those disclosures does put the company at risk of potential further litigation. If, again, moving on, changes in long-term estimation of costs, again, the accountant would need information from the people preparing those reserves and resources, as well as in changes in material grades. So a collapse in an area that might sterilize something, the accountant needs to know that that reserve has been sterilized or that resource has been sterilized, so that that information can be used for the accounting, for the potential accounting consequence. The fact that it happened and the fact that it didn't cost any money is irrelevant when it comes to whether the information is useful to how the accountant prepares their report. Geological changes that result in change of reserve resources, also important. As I said, collapse. And peer reviews. If a competent person's report has been peer reviewed, and as a consequence, that report has been found to have had some element of error, either by omission or commission, and that report needs to be restated, that restated could have an accounting consequence. The fact that that report's gone and we're just going to start with a new number, instead of last year's reserves of 5 million, we're now going to start with this year's reserves of 4.6, let's just move on. That difference between 5 and 4.6 could very well have an accounting consequence that may result in the accountant having to restate prior year financials. So any information changes that the competent person identifies or becomes aware of, absolutely important to be presented to the accountant. If there is any of these failures in these internal governance processes, then the financial reports previously issued may be incorrect, and that can expose the entity to litigation from shareholders, especially if you're US listed. It could expose the entity to fines from regulators. And in some jurisdictions, it could result in action against the competent person. And the BRIEX example, and of course, we don't know whether that competent person is alive or dead because they vanished in a helicopter trip. But that BRIEX position is a perfect example where bad competent persons report resulted in poor financial reporting, and the poor financial reporting resulted in a company ultimately going bust. So accounting conventions dictate the following. Assets are only recognized if there's an estimate of future value. And so if the mine is continuing, if the reserves are still mined, if the reserves are mineable with future cash flow inflows, then you've got an asset. Once a reserve has been sterilized, it's no longer an asset. If that reserve is sterilized, it has no future value and therefore needs to be eliminated from the reserves, which it will be in a good competent persons report, which would then have an impact on the accounting. So the fact that you had 5 million of ounces in reserves last year, you mined 1 million, you sterilized 500,000, and you've still got 5, does not mean that there's no impact for the accountant. That sterilization that occurred during the year could have an impact for the accountant and needs to be reported. The fact that the opening and closing numbers have no difference is irrelevant from an accounting perspective. Assets are de-recognized and amortized as their usefulness is utilized, or when the asset has no future purpose, i.e. that sterilization. It's very important from what was discussed earlier today that liabilities are recognized when the liability is identified. OPEX is not a term in accounting. It's the term in cash flow, but not a term in accounting. Liabilities for an accountant are recognized when the liability exists. So if in terms of your license agreement, you're required to provide schooling and education for a minimum of 10 years in a local area, irregardless of whether you've got any mining taking place, and you say, well, we're going to spend 2 million rand a year, therefore that's 20 million. The accountant will want to know that on day one. The 2 million a year that you're spending is an extinguishment of that liability. The liability existed to give you your right to commence mining operation. The liability is not the annual costs of paying the school fees or paying for the school for your local community. Other areas where competent persons and accountants work intersect, grade and assay results, because the grade and the assay has an impact on the stockpile. There are plenty of situations where the assay in the stockpile has found to be not the assay that ultimately existed at the point in time that the stockpile was utilized, especially if a stockpile is set aside for future use. Reserve estimates are used by the accountants in order to determine asset lives, and they need that information. And as Bruce was talking earlier about life of mine estimates are used by the accountants in order to verify a going concern assumption. Because if there is no life of mine, then the entity is no longer a going concern. Again, other liabilities, as we said, social obligations and social targets, all part of ESG, and environmental obligations that might change in license conditions. So you might have an obligation that they'll only allow you to establish a brand new tailings area if you permanently close the other tailings. That needs to be identified, and the accountant needs to be brought into information on that so that they can assess the correct reporting of liabilities. And taxation, because you might have special treatments in your taxation arrangements in the countries in which you operate, which might give you a lower rate initially, rising to a higher rate over time. Again, more information for the accountant. So in concluding, within my last few minutes, errors in identifying ESG components when preparing a competent persons report could give you financial reporting errors. If these financial reporting errors result in litigation for the corporate, and when it comes to identifying the responsible human, if the accountant is able to create a reasonable reliance and a reasonable man defense on the competent persons report, then it's the competent person who becomes the individual that the litigator and the regulators will go after, and not the accountant because of the poor financial reporting. The accountant may have another problem, but it won't be as a consequence of the competent persons report. And restatement of previous competent persons report need to be advised to the accounting staff. It's not something that you just move on as time began. So thank you very much. If anybody has any questions, I'm going to.
Yeah, Kevin, clearly the part of the payment requirements is that you do a reconciliation of your resource and reserves from the prior year to the current year's reporting. So what you're advocating is that reconciliation process would need a lot more detail than may normally be included.
Sure, Andy. If that reconciliation is a simple one, mined out, newly found, newly identified, changing costing, probably you're fine. But if it mined out, sterilized as a result of changing my plan, and now then you need to give that information, because the costs that we use to create that reserve that's now sterilized are sitting on the balance sheet. And those costs for that area that's now sterilized has no future value. So that cost needs to be taken, needs to be taken off the balance sheet. And it's only the costs for the new areas that can stay on the balance sheet.
And of course, added to that would be the fact that with a different set of price numbers or price deck, you might end up with different cutoff grades, and your resource reserve numbers could change as well, which would also trigger an impairment.
It could trigger an impairment. It's more likely to trigger an impairment on the sterilization than, on an area which you previously had in reserves that you've now said, I'm not going to put into reserves, but don't worry, I've got this other area that's going to replace it. The accountant needs to know that that net zero is not net zero.
Thank you, Kevin.
Kevin, hi, good day. Bruce Williamson here. Hypothetically, you might order two very similar gold mines, say, close by, and you find that their long-term gold price and exchange rate are quite different. Do you get into a debate and a conversation about the assumptions on commodity price and exchange rate?
You do get into a debate on those because, for example, the SEC specifically says that unless you come up with justifying factors, you have to use a 3-year average. And so for an SEC declaration of reserve under their mining requirements for disclosure, you've got a set formula. You haven't got that set formula under the SAMREC code, but you still would, if the guy is saying, I'm going to use $1,000 an ounce and gold is at $1,750, conservatism doesn't exist in accounting, because in reality, if you're applying that methodology, you're robbing the current for the future. You are deliberately understating your reserve in order to give you comfort that the life of mine will last longer. That's not good information. That's smoothing and manipulation. Therefore, you shouldn't be using, let's just say, $1,000 an ounce at $1,750 unless it is fairly obvious that $1,750 or whatever number is currently around is so out of whack with the long-term plan. But I think 1,000 probably is too low at the moment, but that's my judgment. There are several mining companies that do operate at that lower level, and there are others that are at 1,400 in gold for reserves. But there will be a debate on that because of the impact that it does have on the accounting.
Yeah, I mean, I suspect there are going to be some very interesting debates around the PGM miners where some of them had $1,600 per ounce basket price, and it went up above $3,000. It's come off a little bit now, but it's nowhere near last year's long-term price assumption. So I suspect we're going to see some interesting debates and valuations come out. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you very much, Tanya, for convening the ESG Inquisition and for inviting me. The title of the presentation I was given was to specifically look at the overlap between corporate governance and public reporting. And I'm going to be doing this from the perspective of running a listed company. I don't profess to be an expert in any of these particular areas, but this is the 4th public company I'm currently running. So I'm taking it very much from a user's perspective. So the agenda for this 12-minute presentation is set out as follows. I'm going to be talking about some definitions around corporate governance and reporting, reporting specifically for AIM-listed companies, because this is where I've occupied 3 of my roles. Sustainable investment, and like some of the previous speakers, there's nothing really new under the sun here. It's just how we look at it now. Some metrics around ESG and market performance. And then, of course, a presentation like this, it goes without saying that you must make some comment in terms of social media and public reporting. And then the back end of my presentation, I talk about general trends and challenges in reporting, some emerging views on governance and public reporting, and I make a few suggestions there before I conclude. So straight into it, corporate governance and reporting. What do we mean by corporate governance and reporting? And this has been well covered by many speakers up until this point. Good governance is obviously very, very critical to corporate reputation, but probably more importantly, it's very good for running a successful business. So it's not something that you need to pay lip service to. It's something that you actually need to do in order to run a successful business, whether it be a junior exploration company, which is the company I'm running at the moment, or in fact, a large mining company. And somehow this system of corporate governance, of rules, practices, and processes needs to be articulated in the form of a report, which can be well understood by your potential investors as well as your investors themselves. And how is this done? This is typically done in the form of an integrated report, which covers not only the financial aspects, which were well covered by my colleague before this presentation, but also some of the many non-financial, be it environmental, social, and governance aspects in the form of a single intelligible document that's preferably written by the company itself, with guidance obviously from experts. So it presents a very practical representation of the 3 areas of E, S, and G. This needs to be transparent and something that can be interrogated by your investors and your potential investing audience. So what are the kind of frameworks that we look at as AIM companies? If we look at the right-hand side of this slide first, the AIM rules framework, we are very blessed with AIM to work with a nominated advisor, a nomad, and this is our kind of key to talking to the London Stock Exchange. And the nomad is very well versed in areas of governance and reporting, so it enables you to quickly get to adhere to the codes itself, but not just necessarily adhere to them, but to live and actually breathe those codes. And the code that we adhere to and many other AIM companies adhere to is the QCA code, which is illustrated on the left-hand side. So it doesn't matter if you're a small exploration company or a larger company sitting on AIM, this is the code that you must aspire towards and manage. And if you look on the left-hand side, there are things such as a well-functioning and performing board, experienced and capable directors, corporate culture based on ethical values and behaviors, fit for purpose governance structures and processes. And these can happen whether you're a small company or a large company. And then very importantly, building trust and specifically an ongoing dialogue with your shareholders and stakeholders. In fact, this morning, the Botswana Diamonds issued a press release on its updated sampling results. And I'm also a non-executive director of an Israeli company, which also issued a press release this morning announcing its privatization, for want of a better word. And one tries to incorporate in the wording of those press releases something which is intelligible to your average lay investor, but obviously very clearly meets all the kind of governance and reporting frameworks. So what is socially responsible investment? And as I mentioned at the introduction, there is nothing new under the sun here. And please forgive me for going back to 1920 and the comment by Sir Ernest Oppenheimer. I was over 20 years at De Beers, and we were schooled that this was the right thing to do well before it became a fashionable thing to do. And it's a way of rejecting investments in products that conflict with personal belief systems or social, moral, or ethical values. And of course, many of us who are old enough would realize about the sanctions against apartheid in South Africa. And in fact, this is probably one of the most complex areas for a company CEO at the moment, is to balance what is correct, social, moral, and ethical when a country's rules or mechanisms and practices possibly contravene that. And of course, apartheid was one of the most wicked examples actually of that. And then in the 1990s, this was proceduralized, for want of a better word, in terms of the triple bottom line, and has become a very important part of an investment strategy. We're listed in London. We have operations in Botswana, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. And those people who are interested in exploration primarily, and then secondarily, they really want to know what is our strategy and what is our thinking around sustainable investment, around the elements of ESG. Not only is that important from an investment perspective, but it's very important in, I hate to say the word product, but I will call it product for the sake of this audience, in diamonds, because of course, the millennials, they want to have an understanding and they want to feel some kind of moral ownership for who they invest in, with, and how, and especially when they want to go and buy one of our products, being a diamond. They want to buy something that comes from a clean operating environment, which you look after the environment, you look after your communities, you pay your taxes, and you're a good social citizen. And that's particularly important in the diamond business, notwithstanding the importance around investment and the mining business itself. And as you can see from my last bullet here, millennials account for 23% of global population. And by 2025, assuming they keep the same values, which I imagine they would, they're going to become 75% of the global workforce. Not only is it something, ESG, an important aspect for potential investors, as well as your potential markets in terms of the diamond market itself. There is some correlation, and Bruce and others may dispute this, and in fact the correlation is perhaps not that significant, but it is significant in terms of those companies which are strong in terms of quantitative measures around ESG and market performance. So it's a good thing from a business perspective. And some of the questions that we ask ourselves, and the questions that we ask ourselves when we go and see investors and things is, and of course, we're always doing joint ventures and having alliances with other companies as well. So we are an investor in other companies at the same time. Is, would we invest in a company with an inexperienced board? Nope. I think that goes without saying, unless we're acquiring the company. And then we can kind of put our own board and management team in place. Would we consider investing in a mining company that is not serious about the environment? Certainly not. One of the areas in which we work at the moment is in the Central Kalahari Game Reserve of Botswana, which is a pristine nature reserve, which has very strong governance, and absolutely correctly so, with the government of Botswana. Would we invest in an exploration company that neglects its relationships with local communities? No. This is a particularly challenging one in South Africa, where the funds for exploration in South Africa chiefly come from offshore, be it Canada, be it the UK, be it Australia. There is very little, if any, money coming from South Africa itself into exploration in the country. And here there is an expectation from communities that exploration companies have money to start working on a vast amount of community projects, which is something that, of course, you must do once you're actually into production, but an exploration stage that one tries to put as much of your dollars that you raise actually directly into the ground. So at least you have some probability of providing a return to your shareholders. And then moving on to the social media area itself, you will see that the growth, if you look at the graph on the top left-hand side, really started taking off from 2006 and then continued from 2014 onwards in terms of the people using social media. Some companies have maybe been laggards in this particular area, but you look at the importance of Facebook, YouTube, WhatsApp, Instagram, and other means of reporting. And this does give you a direct tool with which to engage with your media. When we posted our RNS this morning, as an example, through the London Stock Exchange, through the regulatory channels, which is a requirement, it was quickly followed up with repeat messages on Twitter and LinkedIn, and then repeat messages around some photographs and things, repeating the message in a pictorial form. Many investors picked up on that and engaged directly on the company's Twitter site and on my personal Twitter handle too as well. So there's a dialogue already. And of course, there are very strict rules which govern that dialogue in terms of, you're talking only about what's publicly available in the market itself. But very importantly here is that bottom left-hand bullet I put in there. The story must be consistent across all these channels. You can't put one thing out on RNS and then have different messages or different media going out on whether it be YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, or elsewhere. It's very important to have that consistent message going across all particular channels, because each channel has its own market and each channel has potential investors and investors itself. And then, of course, this is a very, very quick way to share information across multiple audiences. This is just a very brief snapshot, and I'm not going to dwell on this, but this illustrates the point about what our company does on social media. This is particularly Twitter, in terms of reporting from the site itself, showing images of diamond recovery, of kimberlitic indicator recovery, of drone footage. And then you'll see on the bottom left-hand corner something which some may call part of the kind of ESG framework, but I would call it's just part of your social license to operate, is hosting university tours for aspirant explorers and aspirant geologists, so they can actually know what the job entails, whether it's 40 degrees centigrade at the Marsfontein pit there, and you have to walk up and down and be quite physically active. So moving on to the back part of the presentation, which looks at some discussion on some of these aspects that you have to engage on social media following your public releases. That goes without saying. It's a two-way engagement. It's not the company posting in and then walking away. It's an engagement with your shareholders and your different communities all the time. It's using all of these media, whether it be Twitter or LinkedIn, not just for RNSing, but for financial communication and other forms of communication too as well. And in fact, what I have found, having run public companies the past 15 or so years, is that originally you had websites, webcasting, and PR wire services, which are very common in order to get your message out. That's no longer the case anymore. They are actually struggling to find relevance. But more importantly now is a divergence between companies that are authentic and proactive and those that are merely broadcasting. It's very easy for me to see as a user which companies have PR companies driving their social media because it looks so polished and sometimes, you know, is missing the authenticity or the credibility that is actually coming from the company itself. And investors are very savvy with this and pick up this straight away. So it's important that it's actually done by the company and not by some PR department or investor relations department. Moving on to some emerging views on governance and public reporting. And here I'd like to tackle some elements of governance that could potentially be incorporated in IAR and CPRs. Although I am a competent person when it comes to writing diamond reports and things like this, I'm presenting this from the perspective of somebody who reads many CPRs with a view to a potential investment in that project. And one of the first and most important things I try and look for, and I think is only beginning to come out in CPRs, is a clear depiction of the company's business model and how their strategy relates to this. I.e., why on earth is that company writing the CPR? Often you can very clearly see the companies writing the CPR, which has been well produced purely for marketing needs. I always like to try and see that direct relationship between the business model and the strategy. The second bullet is, on the face of it, could be quite a simple thing, a quantitative risk analysis. But here I think is where it comes into an area of complexity, is a gap assessment between generally accepted governance and then sovereign state practices. And what I mean by that is if you're working in parts of the world where the sovereign state practices fall short of generally accepted governance procedures, particularly from your host country listed exchange, and we're from the UK, you've got to try and articulate that in a sensible and a constructive manner. A discussion on both formal and informal controls, obviously the avoidance of boilerplate disclosures, and then this is not often commonly done, is a clear and transparent table of the remuneration of directors and advisors. So one of my suggestions here would be to incorporate much of this so-called meat in terms of the IAR and CPRs, and then more of the general information, which is useful if you're not resident in the country, such as climate and history and all those kind of necessary things can be possibly at the back of the report or even in the addendum. But there's a kind of a slight caveat to all of this, is that we do need to find the right balance between encouraging entrepreneurship and application of another level of bureaucracy. This is not a tick box exercise. So in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not going to read through this slide verbatim. There are a couple of things I'd actually like to focus on here. And those are the two bullet points right in the middle. It's about walking the talk. It's all well and good to kind of have lovely reports and tick the boxes and have good PR information actually flowing from it. But you've got to be able to actually walk that talk when you're confronted by the community leaders out there in the bush. You've got to be able to walk that talk when you're confronted with a politician or an investor about your company. And the complexity around this, and this is why I've made it a sub-bullet, is what do you do when your sovereign state falls short on generally accepted principles of ESG? As I mentioned in my introduction, I run a company which spans Zimbabwe, Botswana, and South Africa. Botswana is, they call the Switzerland of Africa. It's top of the pile in terms of mining investment in Africa, and in fact, quite close to the top in terms of the world. But Zimbabwe and South Africa are well short of that. And as my school teachers used to say when I was at school, have plenty of room for improvement. How do you handle that? And then the final comment I'd just like to mention is encapsulating all of this. And this comes from my previous chairman of Rockwell, Mark Bristow, is the term a social license. And that basically means integrating all these elements of ESG into the DNA of a company. Now, being a geologist by training, looking after the environment is second nature to me. But so must all those other aspects of good governance, of good social responsibility, of good quality reporting be incorporated at the same time. So thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen, for your time. And I hope it was a productive presentation for you.
Great, thank you very much, Sir James. Is there anybody are there any questions? I don't see anybody that's got any questions. So thank you very much, James, and really for everybody for their talk, right, that they presented today. I'm now going to hand, and to Tanya as well, most importantly, for organizing everything. So I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Keith Rain, who will close out and take it from there.
Hi, everyone. So yeah, I'm just going to run a question and answer session. I think Sarah's covered most of the questions throughout this morning's presentations, but does anyone have any burning questions for any of the presenters that are still online?
Hi Keith, it's Leslie Jeffrey here.
Yes, Leslie, go ahead.
I hope you can hear me. There's noise in the background. So I don't have a question, but I have an observation to make in that for some of us, this aspect of our work is second nature. Like James was saying, we've looked after the environment from the beginning. However, what this has brought out to me is that although some of us have been involved in the beginning, some of us are involved in the end on the accounting side, we don't necessarily all understand the entire chain of the ESG topic and how it needs to be carried through from the beginning all the way through to the end. So I would like to suggest that one of the things that is required is a general education of everybody in the extractive industries so that they at least have an understanding of who the next person in the chain is who will be picking up their information. Thanks.
No, thank you very much, Leslie. I agree with that comment. I think that's a common theme across the board. Is anyone else have any comments, questions?
Hi, this is Rob Barnett speaking. Can you hear me?
Yes, you can.
Oh, thanks. I'd also like to make an observation. I've listened to certain webinars recently on the new energy minerals. And this is not a South African view, but a sort of world view. Appears to be that the investment community is getting more reluctant to invest in the mining prospecting industry. Is it because, well, the whole ESG sort of issue is becoming more and more complex, and as some speakers mentioned, difficult to understand? And is there a general sense of what can be done about this? Because if the investments are moving away from mining, then we are not going to be able to transform into the new energy format.
Does any of the presenters want to chime in on this one?
Yeah, hi, it's Bruce Williamson here. Yeah, I mean, that's, you know, it's a very valid comment or issue to raise that Rob has raised there. And so I want to go back to earlier, there were some comments about surveys done or reference to investors not wanting to. And I think what really has to happen, and I haven't gone physically to go and look for these surveys, but we need to understand who the investors are and exactly what they are calling for. And this is why I keep on coming back. We need to work together, as Rob said. We are not going to move forward into this green energy transformation if we don't have more and more commodities. They require additional commodities. We're battling to keep up with supply at the moment. And so we honestly need to be talking to each other I think we've got to be very careful of the seriously big fund managers around the world. I'm a little bit of a cynic because they can add on an ESG department and cover all of this and tell their clients that they are monitoring, but the rest of the fund managers are going to battle to absorb those costs. So let's find out, are these surveys done? Are they comprehensive? And I think we've got to avoid speculation that, well, people want it. Who are these people that want it? And do they know how to get us to 2040 or 2050 in a decarbonized world?
Keith, if I could maybe add a comment to Bruce's, is one of the things that I find particularly in the exploration environment is it's about risk. It's less about ESG. That becomes obviously, that is important, but it becomes a lot more important as you go into project development and of course into mining. But it's all about risk, and it's all about, are there incentives such as the Canadian flow-through share schemes in order for investors to get involved in exploration? Because it's all well and good talking about mining and ESG, but if we look at the level of investment of exploration in South Africa at the moment, it's incredibly low. And one can actually see a future in maybe 20 years' time where there is actually no exploration, no mining in South Africa, because nobody wants to invest in the country and the country doesn't want to invest in itself. So there is a transformation required from a financial perspective in terms of looking at incentives, looking at allowing fund managers to invest in smaller companies. So looking at less regulation in that area. So we actually do have a mining industry at the end of the day.
Keith, it's Andy McDonald here. I just want to make a comment to Rob's question.
Thanks.
I think part of the problem is that the mining industry historically has been a very high energy user, which has been traditionally fueled by fossil fuels. And the ESG movement is definitely moving away from that. So to the extent that you can change the energy demand of mining, it may become more attractive that way.
Thank you very much for the comments. I agree with you guys there. That's definitely need to take cognizance of all these issues and try pave ways forward for, especially here in South Africa, because this country needs mining. Is there anyone else? All right, I just want to thank all the presenters and Tanya for organizing this for us today. Just a note for tomorrow, please remember that tomorrow starts half an hour early, so log on at 8:15 so we can kick off at 8:30. And yeah, if you have any more questions, just save them and we can hopefully have time to address them tomorrow. All right, thank you everybody. Enjoy the rest of your days.